and welcome to the afternoon's participants. So our first speaker this afternoon is Florian Schwartz of the University of Pennsylvania, who's going to be talking about experimenting with meaning, some cases in presupposition projection. Florian.
Thank you, Mitch. And let me just set up my screen share here. And there we go. Okay, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here celebrating you, Barbara, and really quite an honor. So when people think about experiments and semantics, a common question that Barbara asked is something like the following: semantics, mathematics, or psychology? And that, of course, is a big and important question. I won't do any justice to this paper or that big question maybe, but I hope, at least in spirit, I can join Barbara in her conclusion of the paper, which says that a good theory might be expected to do both at once. So I'm going to take a slightly more basic, grounded approach of what we're looking at here, just starting from the premise that I think we can all agree on, that meaning is an empirical phenomenon and studying natural language meaning is inherently an empirical endeavor, at least in part. So the simple notion here is that our explanandum is linguistic behavior, intuitions about truth of sentences, reference, entailments, etc. And as such, experiments are simply a key tool for empirical science to do good empirical work. They can help us test fine-grained predictions of ever more sophisticated theories, and they can help us to identify and tease apart factors that are at play in judgment patterns. And I think simply taking just the variety of the factors at play seriously leads us to semantics as cognitive science. And that's, of course, also why we're celebrating Barbara's award of the Cognitive Science Franklin Medal and not, the Fields Medal or something like that. So cognitive science, semantics. I think the empirical nature alone forces us to get into the weeds of the cognitive reality of language. Theoretical constructs must have some reflex in cognitive representations, and therefore we will have to engage with testing hypotheses about these cognitive representations. And of course, experiments are one very useful tool for doing so. Another important point, I think, in very general terms, is that oftentimes, the more the theories get more complex, all the more often, we don't just care about the what, but the how. So oftentimes we'll have different theories that predict the same overall interpretive outcome at the end, but they argue about how that outcome is derived. And one angle, at least, for getting at that is, I think, to investigate cognitive processes that are involved in reaching those interpretations with the hope of perhaps finding grounds for differentiating the theories. All of this, of course, that's a big one, right, requires suitable linking hypotheses. So that's really a key part of all of this. Another aspect that I think is present throughout all of linguistics is that a central question for any given linguistic phenomenon is often whether it's best explained in terms of language-specific knowledge or just in terms of domain general cognition. And again, I think experiments can help us tease these apart. So I'm going to talk about some work of my own on presupposition projection, experimental work, first involving the sort of cognitive representations that are involved, and secondly, the role of linear order and left-to-right processing in theories of presupposition projection. And then I'll end with some sort of more general reflections on the role of experiments in the field. Okay, so since we're dealing with the broad and general audience here, I'll try to keep things as accessible as possible and introduce things. So presuppositions are basically a type of meaning that is at least typically taken for granted. In, say, Mary stopped doing yoga, the verb stop introduces the presupposition as we say that she used to do yoga. This is traditionally captured in something like Stalnaker's common ground model. And the whole idea here is of assertions and conversations as a game of updating contexts. The goal of conversation is to increase the mutually shared information. And when you make an assertion, you add information to the common ground, which can be formally modeled as the worlds compatible with the propositions that are mutually endorsed for the purposes of conversation. And so we can neatly represent these things. I missed the blackboard, so I went for a bunch of hand-drawn images here. You'll see lots of these. So we can represent the set of worlds compatible at a given time. So C1 here is the set of worlds compatible prior to the assertion. And then S1 gets uttered, and then you cut things down, you intersect by removing all those worlds that are not in S1, you get the intersection, same for the second sentence. And so we shrink our context and move on. Now, presuppositions classically are seen as constraints on common grounds. So basically a sentence S1 might be associated with a presupposition, some here in yellow, something that has to hold for that sentence to make sense. And the idea then is that you can only assert S1 felicitously in a context C1 that entails, that is where all the worlds within C1 are also worlds within the presupposition of S1. And if so, then you go ahead and do the nice intersecting. And if that's not the case, like in the case on the right, context C1 prime is different. There are some worlds where that presupposition doesn't hold, then things break down. That's the very basic picture. Now, importantly, presuppositions project, that is, various embedding environments like negation, possibility modals and questions have presuppositions from the things they embed sort of go up to the global level. So while all of these do not convey anymore that or don't say anything about whether Mary is doing yoga now or not, they all still do presuppose that Mary used to do yoga. So here we see the sort of the differential impact of entailed and presupposed content. In complex sentences where we have multiple clauses, things get especially interesting, and this is what people working on presupposition have mainly focused on over decades now. So a simple case is conjunction. If the first conjunct is independent of the presupposition, say Mary is in bad health and she stopped doing yoga, you still have the general presupposition of that second sentence. But if you tweak the first sentence just so that it basically takes care of that presupposition, as in Mary used to do yoga and she stopped doing yoga, that complex sentence as a whole then no longer carries that presupposition that she used to do yoga. Here for conjunction, of course, entails it, but it's no longer felt to be a presupposition. You get the very same pattern in conditionals. It's basically the same sentences here. I'm not going to go over these in the interest of time. So the general theory, going back to Cartoon and Staunecker really, is that in order to determine the presuppositions of complex sentences, we have to find a way of determining how the presuppositions of their parts relate to other parts of the sentence. And so the key notion here is that presuppositional expressions are evaluated relative to what we can call their local context. And that local context evolves as the sentence unfolds. So if you have a sentence like S1 and S2, a conjunction of two sentences, then the question for presuppositions of S2, again, the yellow circle here, right, has nothing to do directly with context C1 prior to the utterance of the overall conjunction. Rather, what matters is, well, what are you left with after you update C1 with this utterance, with this assertion of S1, giving you the context S2, C2, sorry, and that has the proper relation to the presupposition, and now things work out, even though the initial global context did not have that property. Of course, it can also be the case, and this is the other examples when the other conjunct is unrelated, that it's not S1 that's responsible for dealing with the presupposition, if you like. If the initial context already entails the presupposition, things can work out equally well, and S1 need not entail the presupposition. So those are basically the two cases we've been looking at. Now, in one line of work with Sonja Thiemann, I've looked at the representation of context. The idea is, right, of all these things we're talking about, what structures are actually present in the cognitive representation of the context? How much do those relate to linguistic structures is another question. And the work we did in particular tested some theories of discourse representation theory, going back to Hans Kamp, who I think at the time was also at UMass, with Barbara. And here we look at sort of different locations of support for presuppositions. This was a processing study using eye tracking during reading on the German version of Again. And we basically layered on top of each other a number of embeddings to give us some room to play with in terms of how deep the embedding is relative to where the presuppositional support was introduced. So we had an if clause and a negation. And in German, we could nicely disambiguate the scope of those two. And so in a relevant part of a target sentence like she is not going ice skating again today, there was a presupposition that she had gone ice skating before. And what we would do in the context manipulation was vary whether that presupposition was supported by information in the global context in a separate sentence. Tina was last week ice skating in Pseudo-German, or whether it was supported in the if clause somewhat closer within the sentence internally. And then the target sentence furthermore varied the relation of not and again. So this is just sort of a broad schematic idea. What in big picture terms is the question we're after? Well, I'm going back to conjunction because it's easier to illustrate, but in relevant ways, this translates to conditionals as well. Basically, what we're trying to ask here, right, these pictures that I drew earlier, the left one representing the case where S1 is responsible for taking care of the presupposition of S2, and the right one, the case where the context C1 overall, the global context prior to the conjunction already takes care of the presupposition, right? There's a question here. Does it matter when you're processing these sentences, which one of those two scenarios you're in? If you draw these full pictures, of course, they look different. But if you take away sort of the history of how you got there, at the time you interpret S2, it might be that all you have access to is this context C2, and you don't know how you got there, and thereby sort of what role the context C1 and the sentence S1 played. So we try to tease that apart. Now, it turns out, this doesn't translate perfectly here, but there's a rough similarity as we transition to this, that discourse representation theory, a version of a dynamic semantics, basically with sort of fairly heavy representations, namely these boxes, gives you exactly something like this history of these different representations. So what we see here, crucially, not going into all the details, the presupposition that X went ice skating before starts out in the yellow circled part there at the bottom in the most embedded bit. So that's in the then clause under negation. That's why it's so deeply embedded in these boxes. And what we try to play around with now as well, how far away, or we can capture in DRT, how far away the presupposition support was introduced, whether it's in the if clause in the global context with the additional bit of the placement of negation. And with this, taking this sort of this distance in the DRT framework as a simple measure, we come up with a neat set of predictions about sort of how far you have to look back in order to find the support for the presupposition in terms of the DRT structure, not just simple linear distance. We're able to tease it apart chiefly because of the again not versus not again variation. So you have this nice tier in a three-way distinction here. And lo and behold, in here showing total reading times on the verb, which is the relevant part where you get the full presupposition of the again at play, we indeed find such nice stacking where depending on how far away in the DRT structure the support was introduced, the longer the reading times, it's quite a neat sort of linear pattern. And it doesn't matter whether it's in the global context or in the if clause, as long as we keep the sort of DRT distance the same. So that was kind of a neat finding that suggests that these context histories, first of all, do matter. And furthermore, that the cognitive context representations at play in understanding these sort of sentences can access richer structures than just these local contexts, just the last C2 bit that I had in my earlier drawings for the conjunction case. And so as it happens, DRT does offer linguistic representations with a structure that's consistent with these results, which is quite nice and interesting. Although in retrospect, as a few years back, I would now emphasize more that we don't really have any specific evidence from these studies alone that what matters is that there's a level of linguistic representation per se at play. It could also be that we have another level of more general contextual representations that preserve a parallel sort of hierarchical structure to what's in the DRT bit. This is relevant because there are other theoretical issues people have pointed out with the DRT framework. So I think there's more to be done here to differentiate these things, and that's not an easy thing to do. But in any case, I think this is an interesting direction of progress of understanding the cognitive representations at play with these sorts of things. Let me turn to the second main set of case studies here, and these look at left to right processing and theories of projection. So if we look at the simple conjunction example again, it's been observed right from the start by Stanwicker, at least maybe even others earlier, that there's these asymmetries of sorts, right? So certainly for conjunction, the claim always has been pretty much that filtering only seems to work when the relevant material comes before the presupposition linearly before. So Mary used to do yoga and she stopped doing yoga like we had before. It's fine, there is no global presupposition of the sentence. But if you flip the clauses, Mary stopped doing yoga and she used to do yoga, that's customarily marked with a hashtag for being degraded. Now, exactly how degraded that is part of what we're trying to determine here, but I think most people do sense some contrast here. So if we take that at face value, the tentative upshot would seem to be that local contexts only include preceding linguistic material. again, we'll have to qualify these things, but this is basically setting up the stage for the studies we did. To the extent that we're playing with the idea here that this is indeed, that there is such an asymmetry, there is a question of what its source is. Where does it come from? Why is linear order mattering in that way? One option is that it's directly in the semantics of conjunction. Another option is that it has something to do with the general aspect of language use, certainly quite clearly with spoken language, that it just unfolds in time. And we have this basic asymmetry between the before and after built in. And so this kind of reflects our general distinction between linguistic explanations versus domain general explanations. So the classic dynamic semantics framework, which really was a big breakthrough in the study of presupposition by Irene Heim, one of Barbara's famous students, right, offered precisely a dynamic semantics that offered a semantic solution to the projection problem of presuppositions, and essentially posited that the semantics of conjunction, which in that semantics amounts to the sort of context update potentials that these expressions have, that in and of itself is asymmetric. So when you have, again, our conjunction S1 and S2, uttered in some context C1, what you do is you go through, by virtue of the semantics indicated here just schematically, by adding with the plus symbol S1 to C1, and that's precisely reflecting the context update that's being done, again, in the semantics. And that's what the meaning of and tells you to do. And then only afterwards, once you put these first two together and get your context C2, do you add your second sentence S2, and that gives us the asymmetry that we've observed before. You can't, right, support a presupposition in the first conjunct with later material. That's the idea. Now, unfortunately, as another illustrious student of Barbara's, Mats Ruth, pointed out, reportedly in a letter to Irene Heim, similar point is also made by Soames, is that on the semantic approach, this asymmetry is actually just entirely stipulative. And so there's an explanatory challenge here. The simple way of putting it is just to say, well, why don't we find languages out there that have an and prime, that's a variant of and, that just encodes the update the other way around, where you first add sentence 2 and only then sentence 1 later. We can write that down and nothing in the theory constrains us. And this would predict exactly the opposite sort of pattern. Alas, we're not finding such languages, it seems. So a very interesting recent development in presupposition theory has been sort of a revival of Stalnaker's original approach, which was very much pragmatic as opposed to the dynamic semantic one. And Philippe Schlenker has sort of revamped that to deal with some shortcomings that such approaches have otherwise, and basically give us the same sort of coverage as a dynamic semantics in the Heim style, but within a perfectly classical semantics where we just have a basic symmetric conjunction like that from statement logic. And the idea is that in this theory that the asymmetry we observe really is just a correlate of left to right order. So I've teased up apart the two steps here, and that just corresponds to the steps you go through in processing. First, you get the first conjunct, and you go ahead at the latest, I guess, when you see the and update the context C1 with that. And then by the time you update with sentence S2, right, you're already only dealing with this, the result of the initial update. So it's just a matter of how language unfolds in time on this story. And a very interesting aspect, and this is really what we're homing in on with the second set of studies, is that on this view, and due to some other complications we'll get into towards the end here, Schlenker proposes that the asymmetry that we observe is merely a default. So it is rooted in this left to right processing preference, but it is just a preference and a default, and it can, in principle, be overridden at a cost. That's the idea. So in fact, the sort of case that so far we've marked as not available, where later information in the second conjunct supports the presupposition in the first conjunct, that is actually in principle possible. It may not be preferred, it may come with, or supposed to come with a cost, but maybe we were too quick to rule that out earlier. The idea then overall is that the basic machinery taking care of projection is symmetric, and that these order effects just emerge based on how we experience language from left to right, so to speak. There's some early experimental data by Schonla and Schlenker that speaks in favor of some of the symmetry, but the key point that we're looking at here is whether conjunction in particular is symmetric after all. And it turns out there's a number of confounds, various things that make it quite hard to study this. One pointed out by Rothschild was that removing redundancy when the second conjunct is not just the presupposition of the other one, but something more informative, then the reverse order case seems to improve somewhat. So Mary stopped doing yoga and she used to do Jiva Mukti yoga. It's definitely better than the earlier variant that we had considered. Just what the status of this here is, I leave open because we actually have some data on this. Now, because of the nature of conjunction, where both conjuncts will contribute, and if it's not a presupposition, we have entailment. Not going into all the details here, we have to actually look at yet another crucial variation to really get at things. And this is that we have to further embed the whole conjunction. So you really want to look at something like, if Mary stopped doing yoga and she used to do Jiva Mukti yoga, then Matt will interview her for a story. So this embedded conjunction here, now we have an actual clear way of teasing apart predictions for what happens with people's judgments. If you assume that a conjunction is strictly asymmetric, then this entire sentence, the whole embedded thing, the entire conditional, should have the presupposition that Mary used to do yoga. But if the later material within the conjunction that she used to do Jiva Mukti yoga can filter, as we say, the presupposition of the first conjunct, then that information should not project, and the global sentence as a whole should not have that presupposition. So if you test your own intuitions, you may see this is not an easy thing to assess. So we wanted to do an experiment to exactly shed some light on that. And crucially, prior experimental work in this area had really not looked on conjunction, partly because it's not easy to come up with the right way of dealing with it. But we thought, so this is joint work with Matt Mandelkern, Jakob Romoli, and Jeremy Zehr. We thought that conjunction is the poster child, if you will, for asymmetry all the way back to Stalnaker, and it's really the case we have to look at if we want to evaluate this question of whether symmetry and whether the asymmetry is just a near processing preference. So our question here then is projection from conjunction ever symmetric, basically? So I'll report the final experiment from our paper here. We had some different task variants, but this one I think is the most convincing. Using an acceptability task, using different presupposition triggers, and then we had a bunch of things we varied, whether that trigger occurred in the first or the second conjunct. We also had control conditions where the global context actually supported the presupposition to give us a baseline. But then crucially, we were working with these so-called explicit ignorance contexts, which I'll show in a moment. So these are contexts where the presupposition is explicitly said to be left open as far as we know in the global context. And so the key that we're getting at is that the symmetric right to left filtering, if you will, is going to be the only remedy here with one qualification that we also control for to avoid infelicity in the key condition. So here are the sort of here's a screenshot of what the participants would see. I won't go through all the details on that screen. Here you see what I meant by the explicit ignorance context. So the crucial condition would be something like, Mary always was involved in a lot of sports, but I don't know whether she ever did any yoga. So that's the explicit ignorance. We don't know whether she did yoga. And then you get the target sentence that you have to judge as acceptable or not in the context. If Mary stopped doing yoga and she used to do Jiva Mukti yoga, and then class was just there for completing the sentence. So this is the conjunct first condition. So the presupposition is in the first conjunct. There's a control where it's in the second. We have other controls, non-presuppositional controls, and simple non-conjunction controls to control for a bunch of other things that I won't get into now. But these are quite crucial to really establish that we show what we think we show. So again, to highlight, there's precisely one point where unacceptability should arise, namely when we're in an explicit ignorance context and the presupposition inevitably rises to the top of the sentence, if you will. It's not caught by filtering or anything else. So this is should be the case in the control condition where there is no other conjunct, what's called simple PS here. So here just, right, if she stopped doing yoga, then blah, blah, blah. So that's one control. And then the crucial case we want to look at is precisely where stop occurs in the first conjunct. And we want to see if that later second conjunct helps via right to left filtering, as we can say, with the second conjunct supporting the presupposition on the first. So here are the results. You see we have lots of different conditions. One key pair is these here. These are the presupposition variance with the presupposition on the first and second conjunct, and we see acceptability ratings on the scale from 0 to, I think it was 5 was the highest, might have been higher. Anyway, what's crucial here is that we find a clear difference. So it matters, the linear order clearly matters. So we do find an asymmetry. Beyond that, we find that that second later conjunct, when the presupposition is in the first conjunct, does not help at all. So it's literally as unacceptable as the simple control condition where there is no second conjunct. And so that's what allows us to say that second conjunct doesn't do anything to help. Furthermore, in all the other conditions, we want to control for a bunch of possible confounds. All of these other conditions come out basically the same way, and that controls for all kinds of other extraneous things that you have to deal with when you have lots of sentences of this sort. So again, to review, what we did here was we set up context where we maximize the pressure to resort to this right to left filtering. Remember, it was supposed to be on one theory available, but at a cost. But here, really, it's the only way out. To ensure felicity, and people are generally very willing to go out of their way in how they interpret things if that's what fixes things, to make them either true or felicitous or both. And we just find no evidence of people resorting to that type of option. And so the theoretical implication of that is that asymmetry in conjunction seems to be categorical. There is no overriding of it. It's not just an overridable left to right processing default. So where does that leave us? Of course, the Schlenker style account has great conceptual appeal in that it has an explanatory advantage. Can we maintain that in any way? Well, one possible way of responding to these data could be to say that, well, that left to right processing pressure is really so strong, it just can't be overridden in these circumstances. That might well be, although as we'll see, it gets you into trouble elsewhere, I think. And the key observation is that the left to right pattern we see based on how the theory is formulated should then be entirely independent of the fact that we're dealing with conjunction, right? So the whole general move was, let's not blame the individual connectives for their projection properties. This is happening across the board. Left to right is present, whether it's and or other connectives. So we should find similar types of patterns for other connectives. And here we nicely can turn to one of those Partee sentences that Polly already appealed to. I've heard it on many occasions that one of Barbara's superpowers is, coming up exactly with the right example sentence. And here we are about 40 years later, still worrying about these sentences and trying to understand them. So disjunction, these so-called bathroom disjunctions, like in either the bathroom in this house is well hidden or there is no bathroom, where the bathroom in this house presupposes that there is one bathroom and that there is a bathroom in this house. But of course, the other disjunct throws that off and leaves it open as a whole, whether or not there is a bathroom. That really seems to look at first sight like we're dealing with symmetric sort of presuppositional support. You can do the same thing with the types of sentences we had in our study. And just to reflect on where this fits in the theory, these sort of symmetric cases were, of course, part of Schlenker's motivation to allow for some symmetric filtering to be available. There's other accounts and other possibilities, theoretical options in the literature. So Hirsch and Huckel, for example, argue that when it's the presupposition is in the first disjunct, you resort to local accommodation. We're not going to get into those details right now, but what's key is that regardless of what theoretical take you have on these options, all the ones that are out there, the relevant ones, agree that there should be a processing cost for the version where the presupposition is in the first disjunct versus the other way around, again, in the Schlenker style account, because of the left to right processing default that's going to be better. So in a study with my student, Alexandros Kalomoiris, we've started looking at disjunctions. In an initial bit that we presented at the LSA, we tried to come up with something very similar to what we had done before with Mendelkern et al. The sentences are relatively straightforward. And the key observation here, again, with all the controls, is basically that we find a completely flat pattern. So unlike in the case of conjunction, where we have the strong difference between the first and second conjunct variants, the middle bars here, there's no significant difference, and they're all equivalent to the non-presuppositional controls as well. So this looks very much like we're actually dealing with symmetry. Now, there's some limitations to that initial study. Alex and I are currently working on further variants of this with a more direct comparison of conjunction and disjunction. So we minimally varied our stimuli and used a different type of embedding. This is still work in progress, but the initial results, one aspect seems to be quite clear, that conjunction and disjunction actually seem to exhibit opposite order effects, and we find an interaction here. There's more to be said about the first disjunct variant with disjunction, but on the bigger picture here, I'll just highlight that, well, the uniformity across connectives is clearly not borne out in the way that you would expect. So to summarize and review the discussion a little bit, the conjunction and disjunction are very different in terms of the role of left to right order for projection. And that seems to basically rule out pragmatic theories that predict uniform order effects across connectives. What does that leave us? What avenues does that leave open? Well, one option is to go back and bite the bullet and say we have to encode the projection properties lexically for and or. That, of course, brings us back to that question about why. What's the explanatory take here on why it happens to be just so? Another possibility might be that we can come up with a variant of a pragmatic theory where the order effects vary across connectives. That's some work in progress that Alex is going, and we hope to make some progress on that in the near future. So I think there's some crucial judgments that are subtle here, and experiments really help. We can account for very complex patterns that are needed for key points. If you just look back at that graph I showed earlier, we don't have intuitions at that level comparing 12 different conditions at once. And of course, in the first study I showed, more fine-grained processing measures can also show us that we can help inform what cognitive representations are involved in relevant ways. I'm about out of time, but I wanted to say a few general things about the role of experiments in semantics and pragmatics, because I think it's sort of appropriate on the occasion. A question I sometimes get asked when I make this pitch for doing experiments, well, should everyone now do experiments? And I think my answer nowadays is that, well, first of all, in a sense, everybody does this anyway. So quite liberally borrowing from Clausewitz, who said that war is the continuation of politics with other means, which I'm not endorsing here, but we can say for the theoretical linguists that experiments are the continuation of minimal pairs with other means, right? So minimal pairs are the key bit of data that we tend to work with in theoretical work. And both aspects here, I think, matter. It's really a continuation. It's not fundamentally different. We're just looking at empirical data of one sort or another. But the other means also matter. So a broader range of empirical tools really expands what we can do. So I would urge us not to think about this as a binary division, but rather, right, the appropriate question should be, well, what experiment or data do I need to make a certain type of point, and then go forward accordingly. I think that's sort of the take I would certainly suggest also for pursuing in how we shape linguistic training. A reasonable minimum goal, I think, is to ensure some basic experimental literacy, know when you want to do an experiment or when it would help, understand the logic of designs and basic data discussion. And I think we also want to foster sort of an environment where collaboration easily evolves already at the student level. If you befriend some experimentalists, you'll see what happy combinations that may make. So again, I think we can leave behind the sort of binary thinking. There's no sense in which, say, a student that's worried about getting into something completely new, but that they have to be a full-blown psycholinguist just because they need a couple of experiments to maybe supplement one of their projects. So I think we want to make this see this all as much more of a continuum. A final point I want to make is just sort of the access to these types of tools. Experimenting has become so much easier since I've been a grad student. So not to tout my own horn here, but Jeremy Zayas in my lab, who has developed one, I think, great online tool for experiments. There's many others out there. These are just browser-based, and everybody can use them. They're free and open access, and you can have an experiment up and running and share it with people within a few minutes, if in a very basic version. So that's a huge advancement. The other huge change, I think, has been the availability of these recruitment platforms, so Prolific, Mechanical Turk, or university subject pools. Makes me feel old when I talk to my students about that. When I think back to when I was a grad student, we had to call up people from lists to try to get them to the lab. And we had to make bite bars out of dental clay. And it really was an ordeal to be an experimentalist. But nowadays, you don't necessarily need a fancy lab and lots of money to get experimental data. You can do a lot and learn these things quite quickly. If you're in the job market, then you want to leave out that last part though, because that's still a good advantage to sell. All right, so I'll wrap up really quickly here because I'm way over time. I think greater range of empirical data can really help us refine our theories. And we do want to ultimately integrate more full-fledged models of cognitive representations with our semantic theories. I think the increased access makes it a lot easier for people to utilize these sorts of tools. And I think another corollary of this reach that we have now is that it really opens up the door to more cross-linguistic work in experimental terms. A lot of people are already doing that sort of thing. And where possible, even, here's the segue to Seth in the next talk, maybe bringing that together with another prominent empirical extension of semantic work with fieldwork, where we can bring these things together. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. So we have, by my timer, about 6 minutes for questions. I see we've got one. We got a couple here right away, both in the chat from the other panelists, and we have a question here from Larry Horn. So I think I'm going, since we are going to have the panelist discussion later today, I think I'm going to defer to the questions from the attendees. So I'm going to invite Larry Horn to ask his question. Go ahead.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thinking back to the early work by Karttunen and Stolniker in the 73-74 period, they laid out the projection properties of conjunction and conditionals very nicely, and showed the asymmetry that you referred to in the case of conjunction. The conditionals case worked very similarly, and then they, at least Karttunen, explicitly left open the case of or. He kind of waffled back and forth on that for reasons that I think are obvious to us now. But in the case of conditionals, you have kind of two factors going on. One is that in the simple case, if A then B, and A and B work very similarly, because in effect, they both involve a proposal to throw out all the non-A worlds and then evaluate the B worlds with that restricted set. The only difference being that in the case of conditionals, after the sentence is over, you kind of go back to the earlier context, and with conjunctions, you don't. But of course, with or, you're not really proposing to throw out the non-A worlds when you have A or B. The difference between conjunction and conditionals, though, is that conditionals involve an embedded structure. And so you don't get the King of France is bald and there is one, or Mary has stopped doing yoga and she used to. But you do get the King of France is bald if there is one, or Mary has stopped doing yoga if she ever did in the past. So you can kind of override the left to right asymmetry simply by the syntax, the non-conjunctive syntax of conditionals. I was wondering if any interesting experiments have been done with conditionals to see how they behave.
Yes, great point. Not yet, as far as I'm aware of. I think it's exactly one of the next key places to go to. So there is some theoretical work by Matt Mandelkern and Jacopo Romoli, papers with names in either order, a Salt paper and one that appeared somewhere else, exploring precisely if final conditionals, if clause final ones. I myself find the data quite hard to wrap my head around, so I do think we want some experiments. And I entirely agree, just like you said, there's an inherent, unlike disjunction and conjunction from the logical point of view, the conditionals are not symmetric in terms of their actual just semantics, but the linear order is flexible and we can put them in either order. That makes them a great test case for any theory that tries to spell out the impact of linear order and how it interacts with particular connectives. I think the general direction, and we're just starting to look at that, and I would love to do some studies, though again, making up the stimuli for this stuff is not easy, but I'm hoping we'll get there. I think a basic starting point, right, is to simply acknowledge that disjunctions and conditionals share something right, already in their logical properties on a, perhaps too simplistic, but still a material implication analysis, you get this equivalence with a disjunction with the conditional. And so we want to flesh out how that can be contrasted with the properties of conjunction and have this differential impact of linear order on projection from the various connectives. So yes, I wholeheartedly agree. Hopefully soon there will be experimental data, but not yet as far as I know.
Thanks.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, about one more question, and there's a question from Hans Kamp, and so I'm going to invite him to ask it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so it's very much in the same spirit as Larry's question. I was just wondering whether you have ever any thoughts or evidence on the question whether these different symmetry behaviors of, for instance, and or, but it might also apply to other binary sentence connectives, whether the difference got anything to do with the different rhetorical functions that these particles are compatible with or express. I mean, and notoriously can only be used in a sort of narrative context where the what's described in the second conjunct sort of in some sense follows up, sometimes even temporarily, on what's said in the first conjunct, and or and if then are really very different in that respect. So do you think there is any hope we can get some explanation of the differences in symmetry behavior from that sort of consideration?
I think it's a really important factor to consider. Thank you for the question. I mean, as you said it occurred to me, right, with conjunction even, we also have some of these sort of more causal-like or threat-like conjunctions. So it actually might be interesting to look at not simple logical conjunctions and see how projection works out there. That could be a different angle. So I think broadly, I just really would say, absolutely, we have to keep that in mind. In the spirit of what I said at the beginning of the talk, we don't know what factors play a role, so we better cover our bases and test for the impact of all of them. And I think the sort of rhetorical nature or role that the different ingredients can play certainly might be important. A very unbaked thought I have about this very new, surprising bit of data where right in the bathroom disjunction type cases, our rating data actually suggests that it's better to have your presupposition on the first disjunct. I have a loose idea that that might have something to do with the sort of rhetorical dimension, I think, where basically having the presupposition on the first disjunct is perhaps more natural because you're sort of alluding to a more default state of affairs, right? So houses nowadays have bathrooms. And so taking for granted, as a first possibility to consider, taking for granted that there would be a bathroom, sort of the natural thing to do. And then the second disjunct in those sentences comes in more as like, well, or, sort of broadening my horizon of possibilities. Maybe it could be a whole different type of situation. But so again, this is very much not fleshed out, but that's my initial take at the puzzling part of that data, where that sort of rhetorical consideration might be useful to explain that, if that falls broadly in the range of the things you thought of.
Yeah, thank you. That helps.
Thanks.
It's
All
time,
right. Yes.
It's time to move to our next talk, as I asked Florian and Seth to switch places. The next talk is from Seth Cable, UMass Amherst, and he's going to be talking about the remote past, recent past, and current past of cross-linguistic formal semantic research.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And again, I'd like to begin by just saying how deeply honored and grateful I am to have the chance here today of contributing one small part to the celebration of Barbara Partee and her work. And where I plan to make my contribution today is in speaking about the topic in one on my handout here, cross-linguistic formal semantics. And I want to start off right away by just making clear what I mean by this term. So what I have in mind here is semantic research in the formal or model theoretic or truth conditional tradition, which aims to capture the apparent variation observed in how languages encode meaning. And I think it's worth noting right off the bat that this notion that I have here on 1 of cross-linguistic formal semantics is actually a really broad one. And so as noted here in 2, pretty much any formal semantic research on a phenomenon or pattern not found in, say English, is at least implicitly cross-linguistic in this sense. And so consequently, nowadays, maybe most formal semantic research is cross-linguistic in this very broad sense. But even still, it didn't used to be this way. And as I want to touch on today, it was Barbara Partee with colleagues like Emin Bach and Angelika Kratzer who really played a major role in driving the field in this direction. And the rest of my presentation here today will proceed as outlined in 3. So I'll start off, first of all, with a relatively brief and highly selective historical tour of work within cross-linguistic formal semantics as defined in 1. And then I'll move on to a less brief, but even more selective tour of some recent research and results in the cross-linguistic formal semantic study of tense. Tense being one area that Barbara is well known for, where Barbara is well known for a number of fundamental contributions. In particular, we'll take a look at work that explores possible variation in the logical or semantic type of tense, such as whether it's referential or quantificational. And we'll also take a little bit of a look at work that explores possible variation in whether tense can or must appear within main clauses. So to begin with my historical tour of cross-linguistic formal semantics, as I hinted at earlier, my use of this term here today is rather expansive. And in a way, I think it could even include some of the very earliest work in formal semantics back in the 1970s, including Richard Montagu's own work, especially in the program of research articulated in his 1970 paper, Universal Grammar, where he states, the aim of the present work is to develop a universal syntax and semantics. This merely illustrative fragment is perhaps sufficiently rich to indicate the manner in which various more extensive portions of natural language may be subsumed within the general framework. And the thing is, given the statement, clearly the goal of Montagu's enterprise was a system that could and should be applied to all human languages. And though not really explicitly recognized by Montagu himself, even in this paper, a consequence of such cross-linguistic generality would be at least the implicit characterization of cross-linguistic differences where they arise. Though, via personal communication, Barbara related to me that Montagu himself may have felt such an interest in specifically human language and variations within that to be parochial in a sense. Of course, however, in the immediate aftermath of Montagu's papers, particularly PTQ, the majority of the creative and intellectual energy at the time was focused specifically on English, but it wasn't long before other languages were incorporated into the program as well. So for instance, in Robin Cooper's 1975 doctoral dissertation at UMass, the first dissertation in semantics from UMass ever, done with Barbara Partee, Emin Bach, and Terry Parsons, there's a chapter on correlatives in Hittite. And the following year, in Muffy Siegel's 1976 dissertation with Partee, Bach, and Parsons, there's a chapter on the semantics and morphosyntax of adjectives in Russian, a chapter that also appears in Partee's seminal 1976 edited volume, Montagu Grammar. Even more notably, in 1977, there's the dissertation by Marian Johnson at OSU with David Dowdy and Arnold Zwicky, which offers an extended study and analysis of the graded tense system in Kikuyu. And there's also, in 1978, a UMass philosophy dissertation by Lawrence Davis, which included a little Montagu grammar fragment of Sanskrit. Now, although all of these works are, I feel, cross-linguistic in that broad sense I defined under 1, there's nevertheless an important caveat I should introduce. So as Barbara pointed out to me in a personal communication, it's important to also recognize that none of these works that I just mentioned are explicitly developing anything like a formal typology that aims to predict the range of observed cross-linguistic variation in the sense of predicts or explains used by generative linguists. And in Barbara's words, the earliest goal of formal semantic theory was mainly showing that a natural language could be described using the same tools that logicians used to describe their invented languages. And it was really only when linguists became more actively involved in the project that attention turned to more of the linguist's goals, including putting constraints on the theory, puzzling about psychological reality, and the goals concerning typology and universality and non-universality. And so in this way, the work of the 70s that we see here, and also a lot of the 80s still, is pretty different from the work of the late 80s and 1990s, as we'll see. So in the 1980s, though, we do find a slow but steady expansion of the range of languages studied by semanticists, and a greater engagement with those questions concerning cross-linguistic variation. And some notable contributions from this time include the 1981 UMass dissertation by Mark Stein on quantification in Thai, advised by Barbara Partee, Emin Bach, and Ed Gettier. And I also include here David Gill's 1982 paper in Linguistics and Philosophy, Quantifier Scope, Linguistic Variation, and Natural Language Semantics. Because although Gill doesn't write within the Montague grammar framework and a compositional semantics isn't provided in this paper, this work is still very much informed by the broader model theoretic and truth conditional approach to meaning. And the facts and patterns discussed by Gill were important to later cross-linguistic semantics, semantic studies of quantification too. There's also some excellent papers on long-distance reflexives in Japanese and Korean by Gunji in 1983 and Kang in 1988. And we also, in 1987, we have Maria Bittner's IJAL paper on the semantics of Greenlandic antipassive and related constructions, which I believe was the first article in IJAL ever to have anything like formal semantics in it. But also in 1987, a major event occurs that will go on to have major repercussions throughout the 1990s. Namely, Barbara Partee, Emin Bach, and Angelika Kratzer together conceive, develop, and are awarded funding for the research project Cross-Linguistic Quantification, the very first project of its kind, one whose goal was to apply formal semantic tools to the investigation and analysis of cross-linguistic differences in quantificational structures and their meaning. And this project would spawn a number of associated symposia and conferences in the late 80s, and ultimately, in the 1990s, the landmark 2-volume work that I'll talk about shortly. And so we come to the 1990s, which I label here the glorious 1990s, where cross-linguistic formal semantics really explodes onto the scene in much the form that we know of it today. And it's important to note here too that it's during this time that we find some of the first explicitly typological work in formal semantics. And a major venue for all of this work, as well as really a major catalyst for the explosion in cross-linguistic formal semantics itself, is the journal Natural Language Semantics, founded at the start of the decade by Irina Heim and Angelika Kratzer. And as I note here, Natural Language Semantics, or NALS, as we commonly refer to it, really becomes the venue for cross-linguistic formal semantic research in the mid to late 1990s. Now, as you can see from the really lengthy list of works on pages 3 through 5 of this handout, a list that is still by no means comprehensive, the 1990s really did see an explosion of work in cross-linguistic formal semantics. And this was partly a natural consequence of the larger expansion during this time of formal semantic research in general. But it's also worth noting that the grand majority of this work appears after 1995 and after the publication of Bach, Jelinek, Kratzer, and Partee's Quantification in Natural Languages, a 2-volume work the likes of which had never before been seen and really wasn't seen again until Keenan and Paperno's 2012 Handbook of Quantifiers in Natural Language. And even 26 years later, the range of languages and phenomena covered in this work is really astounding, including Haisla, Mohawk, Kalaallisut, Walpiri, Hindi, Mayali, Navajo, Georgian, Tagalog, Maricopa, Turkish, Lemi Salish, ASL, Asarani-do Turkara. Its impact cannot be overstated, and it's no accident that in the following years, and especially starting in around 1998, we find just an incredible flowering of work in cross-linguistic formal semantics. And again, it's worth noting, as you can see on my handout here, that the vast majority of all these works were published in the new journal, Natural Language Semantics. So, following the 1990s, there's such an exponential increase in the area of cross-linguistic formal semantics that it no longer really makes sense for me to identify and list specific works, but I do want to mention a couple key milestones. First, in 2001, there was held the very first meeting of semantics of underrepresented languages in the Americas, now widely known as SULA. Organized by Angelika Kratzer and Lisa Mathewson at UMass Amherst, this was the first conference to ever be entirely devoted to cross-linguistic formal semantic research on indigenous American languages. featuring work on such languages as Squamish, Yucatec, Passamaquoddy, Quechua, Navajo, ASL, and African American English. And ever since then, it's been a major biannual event of critical importance to the field of cross-linguistic semantic research, as has been its sister conference, founded in 2014, which focuses on African, Asian, Australian, and South Pacific languages. Now, next, if we're talking about the growth and development of this field of study, we have to recognize the special importance, I think, of Lisa Mathewson's article on the methodology of semantic fieldwork, which appeared in 2004 in IJAL. And here, for the first time ever, I think, this article provides a systematic presentation, explanation, and defense of elicitation methodologies in semantic fieldwork. And so it was absolutely indispensable to the field's development in the following years, and it's since been followed up by two other equally important and valuable works, such as the book, Methodologies in Semantic Fieldwork, by Mathewson and Ryan Bochnock in 2015, as well as the more recent paper, Techniques in Complex Semantic Fieldwork, also by Mathewson and Bochnock. Finally, I'd like to mention one third exciting development that's happened over the past 20 years or so, and that concerns the way that formal semantics has begun to inform the great Russian fieldwork tradition. So as many folks here know, for centuries, linguistics in Russia has been notable for its strong tradition of fieldwork on indigenous Eurasian languages. Since the 2000s, too, scholarship in this tradition has incorporated more and more ideas from formal semantic theory. And this can be seen in the work of a number of works by a number of people. But as one example, there's the extensive body of work by Sergei Tatyavosov. And it should be noted that these developments are also partly the result of Barbara Partee's work in Russia, particularly her annual courses on formal semantics that are taught in Moscow. So this has been a very brief bird's eye view of where cross-linguistic formal semantic research has come from. But what have we gained from this endeavor? Well, under 9, I offer an extremely biased and again, very selective overview of what I think are some major results of this line of work. First, it's uncovered aspects of cross-linguistic variation that had never really been imagined by either linguists or philosophers and logicians until they started working together. That is, it really wasn't until linguists, philosophers, and logicians started working together under the general auspices of formal semantics that these potential areas of linguistic variation could even be conceived of, let alone, articulated and investigated. And I have in mind here such topics as the encoding across languages of so-called de-se attitudes, as well as the discoveries that have been made regarding how modal operators seem to differ in their semantics across languages. Secondly, work in this field has offered a clear formulation and elucidation as to how to uncover and analyze semantic variation when it arises. And I want to point here to the paper, How to Investigate Linguistic Diversity, Lessons from the Pacific Northwest by Henry Davis, Carrie Gillen, and Lisa Mathewson that came out in Language in 2014. Finally, thanks to this work, there's now a relatively broad range of semantic phenomena and topics that have been examined from a cross-linguistic and typological perspective, though this list could always be made broader and deeper. But some notable examples include, for example, comparatives and degree constructions, nominals and nominal quantification, so-called de-se attitudes, as I mentioned, but also perspective phenomena more generally and indexical shift, plurality, number, and pluractionality, mood, modality, and evidentials, focus, focus sensitivity, and focus constructions, and last but not least, tense and aspect. And on the handout here, I list just a very few very recent articles that provide, I think, a nice overview of some of the most important work that's been done on each of these topics. Okay. So, having now shown you a little bit of how the field of cross-linguistic formal semantics has developed over the past half century or so, let me spend the rest of my time here today touring just one very small corner of this world. Specifically, I'd like to talk just a little bit about some of the work that's been done exploring just a little bit of the variation we find in tense systems across the world's languages. To begin, though, we need to lay out some fundamental background assumptions regarding what tense is and what its semantics is generally like. So first, as stated in 10, semanticists generally understand the term tense to designate a grammatical or functional category whose meaning indicates the position of some topical interval of time, often referred to as the topic time. Next, I lay out under 11 some commonly held but still controversial assumptions about the morphosyntax of tense. In particular, much but not all of the work on tense in the formal semantic tradition assumes that tense features like past, present, and future are realized by so-called tense heads or T-heads, which project tense phrases or TPs. And typically these TPs are part of the functional projection of the verb above any aspectual phrases or ASPPs and below any complementizer phrases or CPs. Finally, one third key assumption I need to just put on the table concerns the mechanics of semantic interpretation. So tense is one of the many phenomena of natural language that show us that the meaning of an expression depends upon the time that that expression is said. Consequently, we want to build that in explicitly into our formal theory of semantic interpretation. So as stated in 12a, we take semantic interpretation to always be relative to a so-called evaluation world, which is more or less the universe an utterance is made in, as well as a so-called evaluation time, which is more or less the time that an utterance is made at. And these parameters of interpretation are traditionally indicated in our notation via superscripts to the, let's call them double brackets, used to indicate semantic interpretation. Next, for reasons that will become clear in just a second, we also need to say a little bit about how pronouns are interpreted in our formal semantic theory. And as shown in 12b, as has been done for a long time, but perhaps not correctly, as was brought up in Polly's talk, we're going to interpret pronouns via a so-called variable assignment, often represented via the letter G, which is a function from pronominal indices to reference. So for example, the pronoun he bearing the pronominal index 3 would be interpreted as whatever the variable assignment G maps that pronominal index 3 to. So for example, in a particular context, some entity like Bill. Now, with all this as background, I can lay out in 13 some of the major questions regarding tense that have driven research, cross-linguistic research on it over the past 40 years or so. So first, we might ask, as in 13, how might languages differ in terms of the semantics of the tense heads themselves? So in particular, do we want to say that tense heads directly refer to a particular topical interval of time, like a temporal pronominal would, a word like then? Or do tense heads seem to quantify overtimes, like temporal indefinites, like the expression sometime in English? Secondly, we might ask, as in 13b, how do languages differ in terms of the syntactic projection of tense heads? That is, are there languages that don't have tense heads in their main clauses? And are there languages where tense heads and main clauses are purely optional? Thirdly, we could ask the question in 13c, how do languages differ, if at all, in terms of the features that show up on tense heads? This is more or less the question, are there tense features in languages beyond just the categories past, present, and future that we're familiar with from English? Now, for reasons of time, I'm not going to be presenting anything on this fascinating topic here today, but I list a number of key references on the handout for those who might be curious. Finally, we might ask, as in 13d, how do languages differ in terms of the morphosyntactic distribution of tense heads? In particular, are there languages where tense heads can be projected by nouns, where nouns can be tensed? And again, I won't have time today to say anything about this, but I do provide on the handout just a few important recent works for those who might want to learn more. So in the following sections, I'm going to take an extremely biased tour of some of what's been recently uncovered and argued regarding the issues in 13a and 13b. Even though I should mention, it's really the topic in 13c and the phenomenon of so-called graded tenses that actually inspired the title of my talk here today. So, you know, the title of my talk is kind of a jokey reference to graded tenses and categories like near past, current past, and so forth. But I had to drop that topic from the talk, but I kept the title, even though the joke no longer makes sense. Anyway, so to begin with our discussion of the semantics of the tense heads themselves. In the very first formal semantic analyses of tense in English, found in the works of Richard Montague, tense features are interpreted as introducing existential quantification over times. So for example, a sentence like the one in 14, I turned off the stove, is analyzed as being true at some particular evaluation time t, if and only if there's this other time t prime that precedes t, where the speaker turned off the stove at this time t prime. Now, as many people here are aware, you cannot talk about the semantics of tense without talking about Barbara Partee forgetting to turn off her stove. So, as noted in 15, in a seminal foundational paper in 1973, Partee famously observes that this quantificational semantics for tense in 14 seems to make incorrect predictions regarding the interactions between tense and negation. So to illustrate, consider a scenario like the one in 15a, where the speaker has made some cookies and is driving them over to a friend's house, and in the car they realize that they left the stove on. The fact is that in such a scenario, one can truthfully and felicitously utter the English sentence in 15b, "I didn't turn off the stove." Unfortunately, though, the quantificational semantics back in 14 is not going to get this quite right. That semantics predicts that the sentence in 15b should have one of two interpretations depending upon the relative scopes of negation and tense. So if the tense scopes over negation, the interpretation we'd get is the one in Roman 1 here, which states that there is some past time t prime, such that it's not the case that the speaker turned off the stove at t prime. But as Partee points out, this is not really the interpretation that sentence 15b gets in that scenario in 15a, because this reading in Roman 1 would be too weak. All it says is that there's a past time where the speaker is not turning off the stove. And that's made true by any past time t where the speaker is not doing that, such as a past time t prime where the speaker is, say, in her car and starting her car. On the other hand, if we have negation outscoping the tense, the reading we get is the one in Roman 2, which states that it's not the case that there is some time t prime that precedes t where the speaker turns off the stove. But as Partee points out, this is also not the interpretation that 15b gets in that context, because this one is too strong. It basically says the speaker has never turned off the stove ever in their life. And that is way too strong for that sentence in that context. So it looks like the quantificational semantics in 14 does not get the right interpretation for sentences like 15b. What would do a better job? Well, Partee famously notes that we seem to get a better analysis of past tense in 15b if we treat it more like a pronoun, directly referring to a topical interval of time. So as illustrated in 16a, we could take a past tense t-head as bearing a pronominal index like 4. And so relative to an assignment function g, it's going to end up referring to whatever interval of time the assignment function g maps that index 4 to. And since it's a past tense t-head, it will also say presuppose that that interval of time lies within the past of the evaluation time. With this kind of a semantics, the sentence in 15b would be interpreted as in 16b, as being true if and only if the speaker failed to turn off the stove at the topical interval of time that the tense directly refers to. And in a scenario like the scenario back in 15a, that topical time could be, say, the time when the speaker took the cookies out of the stove. So a pronominal or referential semantics for tense in English seems to make better predictions regarding the interactions between tense and negation. And Partee also points out in this famous paper that it also correctly predicts a few other parallels between tense in English and pronouns. So for example, as noted in 17a, under this view, tense in English is correctly predicted to exhibit anaphora to times previously mentioned in the discourse. And as noted in 17b, tense in English is also correctly predicted to exhibit what seem to be bound readings in sentences like whenever it rained, Dave cried. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the details of these claims, though they're here on the handout if you're curious. So these were some of the original arguments made by Partee in 1973 that tense in English seems to have a pronominal or referential semantics rather than a quantificational one. However, as you know, I'm sure a lot of folks in the audience here today know, as noted in 18, other researchers subsequently found that there were ways of amending that quantificational analysis for tense in 14 so that it can capture these various facts in 16 through 17. And so nowadays, the literature on tense in English is at something of a stalemate in trying to decide between whether tense in English is best analyzed as pronominal, like in 16, or quantificational, as in 14. But we could, of course, seek to advance this issue by considering other languages. In particular, we might ask ourselves the questions in 19, are there languages where tense heads are more clearly quantificational rather than pronominal in their meaning? And are there maybe languages where tense heads are even more clearly pronominal rather than quantificational in their meaning? Now, the first work I'm aware of that really engages with those questions in 19 is that of Toshio Gihara and Yael Sharvit, who argue that in order to capture the differing behavior of embedded tenses in Hebrew versus Japanese, one has to view the past tense in Hebrew as being pronominal, while the past tense in Japanese can be quantificational, at least under one allowable reading. Now, one feature of Ogihara and Sharvit's work here is that it's largely focused on the interpretation of embedded tenses, tenses in subordinate clauses. And if attention is restricted just to main clauses, it's still generally hard to find clear evidence, even in Japanese or Hebrew, either for or against a quantificational or pronominal semantics for tense. However, in a paper from just last year, Chun and colleagues argue that the main clauses of the Austronesian languages Javanese and Atayal provide some striking evidence that tense in these languages is quantificational. So to begin, Chun and colleagues argue that unlike in English, past tense in Javanese does scopely interact with negation in the ways predicted by the quantificational semantics in 14. So as shown in 21a, if negation precedes past tense in Javanese, the resulting meaning is that there is no time when the sentence is true. And as shown in 21b, if past tense precedes negation, the resulting meaning is that there are times where the sentence is false. And similar facts are reported by these authors for the Atayal language as well. Furthermore, Chun and colleagues show that past tense in these languages seems to exhibit none of the pronominal behavior that Partee 1973 observes for past tense in English. So for example, as shown in 22, past tense in these languages cannot directly deictically refer to some topical pastime. So in Partee's classic "I didn't turn off the stove" scenario, it's actually infelicitous in these languages to use past tense. And as shown in 23 through 24, past tense in these languages also does not exhibit either the anaphoric or the bound interpretations that past tense seems to allow for in English. So altogether then, Chun and colleagues come to the conclusion in 25 that these past markers in Javanese and also Atayal are not pronominal tenses as claimed for English past tense in 16. Now, the folks in the audience here today who are savvy to the semantics of tense and aspect may well be wondering whether these supposed past tense markers in these languages should not actually be analyzed as species of aspect, such as perfect aspect. And of course, Chun and colleagues consider this, and they just point a variety of empirical arguments, facts against it, and which point instead indeed to the conclusion that these morphemes are indeed tense heads sitting up in the TP position, and they're not aspects like perfect, which leads them to the major conclusion in 25c that the past markers in Javanese and Atayal are existential tenses, as originally claimed by Montague for English past tense in 14. So the main upshot of this work then is, as stated in 26, whether tenses receive a pronominal or quantificational semantics may be a point of cross-linguistic variation. So there do seem to be languages where even in main clauses, it can be seen that tenses receive a quantificational interpretation. However, there's an important caveat to be mentioned here, which is that even in languages that have been argued to have truly quantificational tenses, there's still apparently tense heads that receive a pronominal or referential interpretation. So for example, Ogihara and Sharvit argue that past tense in Japanese is actually ambiguous between a quantificational and a pronominal meaning. And Chun and colleagues argue that there are in fact other pronominal tenses in these Austronesian languages. However, laying that out requires that we first talk a little bit about the phenomenon of so-called tenseless languages, which is what I will turn to next. So what is a tenseless language? Well, as stated in 27, the fact is that a great many languages across the world allow main clauses to lack any tense marking at all. And generally such sentences are relatively open in terms of when the event or state they describe takes place. So for example, in the language or Lillooet Salish, it's possible to have main clauses like the one under 27, which contain no tense morphology whatsoever. And sentences like this can seem to allow for either past or present construal. So this sentence can mean either I am hungry or I was hungry. So the existence of languages like this raises the fundamental questions in 28. What exactly is the morphosyntax and morphosemantics of sentences like 27 in the languages that allow them? Is there a tense head and TP at all in these sentences? Maybe at some more abstract underlying level, or do they completely lack tense heads and tense phrases entirely? Also, secondly, how does the temporal interpretation of such sentences take place? If it's not done with tenses or tense heads at all, how does the temporal interpretation of the sentence get computed exactly? And in the literature that it considers these questions, one major issue that comes up frequently is the general pattern in 29 here, which is that in a great many languages that allow main clauses without tense marking, those clauses cannot be used to refer to future events or states, only present or past ones. So for example, we see in 29a that sentence from 27 in Lillowit Salish can be used to describe states of hunger that hold now or in the past, but not ones that are going to hold in the future, like tomorrow. And this same basic fact is illustrated for a couple other unrelated languages in 29b and 29c. So far, there have been two main responses to this general pattern in 29. First, as stated in 30a, one proposal is that these languages possess a phonologically empty non-future tense. That is, even though the main clauses of these languages seem to lack tense marking, there is nevertheless a more abstract phonologically empty tense head, which has a value like non-future. And as shown under 30a here, that would go that, relative to some variable assignment g and evaluation time t, the reference of this tense head is whatever g maps the index of the tense head to, as long as that temporal interval is not in the future of the evaluation time. However, a second hypothesis regarding those facts in 29 is that there's just some general pragmatic cognitive principles of temporal reference that militate against referring to the future without special modal marking on the predicate. Now, a further complicating factor in this debate is that the pattern in 29 is not absolutely universal. That is, there's languages that don't exhibit it. So as illustrated here in 31, this has been claimed, for example, for the language Javanese by Vanderklok and Matthewson in 2015. And these languages, main clauses without tense marking, can relatively freely describe future events. So this raises the unresolved question in 32 then. What is the best and most plausible way of capturing the variation we see between languages like those in 29 and those like in 31? If we think, and here's the thing, this is as pointed out by Chun et al. 2020, and I'll wrap up in just a minute. If we think that the seemingly tenseless main clauses of these languages have a phonologically empty tense head, then as shown in 32a, we could model the difference between the pattern in 29 and the one in 31 as ultimately just a difference in the semantics of that empty tense head. But if we think that tenseless main clauses are instead completely lacking of any tense heads whatsoever, then as stated in 32b here, we have to assume that this difference between the languages in 29 and those in 31 is due to some kind of variation of the pragmatic principles used to determine the temporal reference of the sentence. So while this debate is very much open, I will finally mention that as pointed out by Chun et al. 2020, some independent motivation for that approach in 32a, which posits phonologically empty tense heads, might be actually found in the special pragmatic effects that overt tense marking has in these languages. So this is discussed in the following sections of this handout, and it's the only sections of this handout that actually discuss my own work. For reasons of time, I'm going to kind of cut to the chase here, which is that when optional past tense marking shows up in sentences in these languages, there are these special inferences that usually kick in that the event in question does not extend into the present. I argue in a 2017 paper that these are best analyzed as pragmatic effects because they are defeasible in certain contexts. So summarizing very briefly, the analysis in that story is that these pragmatic effects of using overt tense marking in these languages is best understood as a pragmatic competition between two different tense heads, the phonologically empty tense head and the phonologically expressed past tense head. And Chun et al. Point out in their 2020 paper that this looks, they kind of say, yeah, this is pretty good. But notice that this line of analysis really requires that there be this phonologically empty tense head sitting in the sentence when it doesn't have any overt tense marking. And it's not readily apparent how you extend an account of this sort to a theory of these languages where there aren't any tense phrases in such sentences at all. Finally, Chun et al. Also point out that at the end of the day, to really get these observed pragmatic inferences of using overt past marking in these languages, you kind of do have to assume that the overt past tense that shows up is quantificational. So to summarize, languages do seem to vary in whether past tense marking exhibits the properties expected of referential or pronominal tense or quantificational tense. However, I still think we shouldn't and can't close the door to the possibility that tense is always either pronominal or quantificational across languages, and these observed differences may still be due to other factors we don't quite understand yet. Moreover, to my knowledge, every language that's been claimed to have a quantificational past tense is still also claimed to either allow a referential reading for that tense too, or have other tense markers that are referential. And finally, there are languages that seem to allow main clauses to lack tense marking. However, people disagree in whether, the interpretation of the sentences without tense marking in those languages is best captured via a phonologically empty tense head or pragmatic strategies for construing tenseless clauses. And finally, some special so-called discontinuity inferences that you see in these languages when you use optional past tense markers has to date relied upon the assumption that the seemingly tenseless main clauses do have these unpronounced tense heads. And thank you so much again for inviting me to be a part of this event. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Seth, for a great talk. We do have some time for questions, and our first question is coming in from Muffy Siegel. And Muffy, I'm allowing you to talk now.
Thanks, and thanks for that great tour of work on tense. I needed that. That was wonderful. I just have a comment about your characterization of the first few dissertations from UMass where we considered data from other languages. Didn't feel at the time as if we were just saying, hey, well, we can do this with other languages. It felt very much as if there were important theoretical stakes. And I think maybe we don't see that now because we take for granted, say, how important compositionality is. But when I was working on the Russian adjectives, and there's another chapter on Namambo adjectives from Cameroon, the idea was that the morphosyntax of the Russian ones kind of predicted that there would be semantic variation in the Russian adjectives, and then in fact in languages in adjectives in other languages as well. And that's what I was trying to do. As I remember, I think we were all very nervous about, maybe Robin's here, you hear Robin? But I remember we were all very nervous about those Hittite relative clauses because they appeared to be not compositional. And when Robin figured it out that they could be analyzed that way, that was, in fact, they were best analyzed that way. That was a big theoretical deal. So I just wanted to add that. I don't know. Barbara remembered it that way or not, but that's the way I remember it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the sense I get too as a reader of the papers from those times. And yeah. I mean, I one can see from the claims in those papers, how just the interesting differences between those structures and those languages and the things that we would see in English. Yeah. Thank you.
We have time for another question. Hans Kamp is submitting a question. Let me allow you to talk. And there you go, Hans.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, so just out of interest, these languages like Japanese with quantificational tenses, what means do they use to express past tense narrative progressions? I mean, it was this kind of issue at the time when sort of I saw it at the time. Linguistic semantics or formal semantics were trying to emancipate itself from the pressures of priori and tense logic. What tenses did or can do in discourse, like in particular in Barbara's paper from 1984, this normal and temporal and afra, that played historically a certain role in trying to rethink about how tense actually works in conjunction as this aspect operates in natural language. And from what you say, one might actually expect that if you have a language where tense is really quantificational, then these discourse phenomena pan out differently. And I just wanted to know if you know anything on that particular point. Do these languages really express past tense discourse in a different way than you have with languages with more non-quantificational pronominal tenses?
Yes, if I could share my screen again. So the
I'm afraid
answer.
we only have time for a short answer.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll stop.
No,
I'll
no,
stop.
it's okay. No, go ahead.
So the short answer is they don't have they drop the tense. So Javanese and Atayal are instances of these so-called tenseless languages I was mentioning, where they allow main clauses that don't have any tense marking whatsoever. So in the case of past tense narratives, they simply, what's particularly interesting is you will see, according to the authors, you will see a past tense show up at the beginning of the narrative that introduces this past time, much as you'd expect an indefinite to introduce a particular, new referent into the discourse. And then all the subsequent sentences simply lack the tense marking. So this is in the context of the paper, part of their motivation for saying this language still has a referential anaphoric tense. It's just the null tense that is showing up when the overt tense marking is dropped.
Kind of null anaphora.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seth. So for our last talk of the afternoon, but before I introduce that, I just want to say to everybody, the schedule was a little unclear, but after Chris Potts' talk, which is coming next, there's going to be a panel discussion of all of our speakers for the day. So I'm pretty sure you want to stick around for that. So with no further ado, let me introduce Chris Potts from Stanford University, who's going to be questioning some of our presuppositions, I think, talking about compositionality or systematicity. Chris.
Thank you, Mitch. I'm going to start presupposing you can hear me and that I'm sharing my screen. Are all those presuppositions correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so this talk is going to be a meditation on the compositionality principle, which, of course, as we all know, is a deep theme of Barbara's work. I think no one has done more to articulate this principle and explore its consequences. And as we'll see, those consequences are far-reaching indeed. So this morning, Barbara talked about those heady early days of discovering Montague grammar and compositional semantics. And I remember asking her years ago whether she knew in that moment that she was participating in a period of intense scientific discovery. And to my delight, and maybe partly to my envy, she said, yes, she did know. And she described this scene of being in the library and just feeling, before she knew, but just feeling that all these longstanding problems of generative semantics and transformational grammar were just going to fall into place. And I think this is the Barbara of that era, looking confident in a Montague grammar t-shirt. I think this is inspiring. And of course, she was right about that moment. The reach of these ideas is truly astounding. And one way we can begin to get a grip on that is that when Barbara nominally or administratively retired in 2004, we created the Partee PhD genealogy. And you can't read this. That's part of the point. We had to print it on a 6x4 foot sheet of paper in order to make it at all legible. But this is Barbara here. And these are all her students, and then stretching out through the generations and encompassing a very large part of semantic and pragmatic theory. And that's just one sense in which these ideas have had incredible consequences and reached far and wide throughout our landscape. So that kind of cues up my central questions here, which do turn on that compositionality principle. What I really want to ask is, when linguists seek compositional analyses of linguistic phenomena, what are they trying to do? What principles guide their investigation, and what goals are they actually pursuing? Because after all, presumably it's not just allegiance to compositionality that's driving them, but rather that's a proxy for some other scientific goal. What is it? And just to give the plot ahead, what I'll say is that the questions lead me to the idea that learning semantic representations might lead to richer theories of language and language use. And I mean learning in the sense of machine learning and natural language processing. But compositionality is too constraining in those situations, and that we might want to back off to a broader notion of systematicity, which I think would still abide by the core principles of Barbara's work, but maybe allow us to do more in more flexible ways. So here's my plan. I do want to talk about the compositionality principle, but that's really just to cue up the idea that what we actually have here is a working heuristic that's guiding the choices that semanticists make. And after that, in sections 3 and 4 here, I'm going to make connections with natural language processing. I'm going to show you that this idea of compositionality has had important consequences for the theories that are being developed now, and those consequences continue to grow and expand. And part of what you'll hear me saying is that I hope we can have some of the lessons flow back into our field. There are some things people are learning in natural language processing that I think could productively inform the choices that we make as semanticists and the analyses we offer. So let's dive into that compositionality principle. Here's an informal statement of the principle, straight from Partee's work. The meaning of a phrase is a function of the meaning of its immediate syntactic constituents and the way they are combined. Semanticists all over the world ironically memorize this into a kind of idiom. This is a guiding principle for a lot of the work that they do. And to give you a sense for how the principle operates, here's a simple syntactic structure for the sentence, "Every student admired the idea." And you can think of compositionality as implying a kind of recursive process. So I might start from the bottom. I have to memorize as a language learner the meanings of these lexical items. And then compositionality is saying that it's empirically a fact that the meanings of those complex phrases are fully predicted from the meanings of the parts. And it's in turn a pressure on the semanticist to develop a theory that accounts for that systematic process. And that goes all the way up the tree. And you could also think of it as a reverse process where you start with the full sentence meaning. And the claim of compositionality is that you can systematically decompose the parts until you get back down to those atomic lexical items. That's the guiding principle. And here's the usual motivation for this. First of all, we might just want to model all the meaningful units. This could be a kind of goal of lexicography. I have this tree over here, and maybe I just feel a pressure as a linguist to give a meaning to every single one of these nodes, all the way down to the root nodes down here. And this is, of course, a source of tremendous abstraction in the context of semantic theories, because it's now a pressure on us to give a meaning even for an isolated word like every. And the trick semanticists pull is that they don't quite give a meaning of every in isolation. They give a meaning with some holes in it, represented by these lambda operators. And you can imagine every crawling around in this tree, swallowing up arguments like student and admired the idea. And only then do we get a sense for what every has contributed to the whole. There's also a guiding intuition in the literature that compositionality would account for our so-called infinite capacity. I'm not going to say too much about that because I think that's probably misleading. Even with a finite capability, even with a finite number of sentences, we could be tremendously creative with language. So I think this isn't something we have direct empirical connection with. But these next two we do. We can be incredibly creative with language, and compositionality would be one way of explaining why we're able to do that so flexibly. And then there's a related notion that you can see in my title, and that's this notion of systematicity. That's an old idea from cognitive science, and it's just the intuition kind of observationally that if you understand the meaning of this sentence here, and you understand that professor and student are kind of alike distributionally, then you'll understand the sentence, every professor admired the idea as well. And that will have a predictable consequence for how you interpret the sentence. Now, notice that that's an important aspect of cognition, especially as it pertains to language. And it is a strictly more general idea than compositionality. If we had compositionality strictly throughout our language, I think that would guarantee all the observations that fall under the rubric of systematicity. But of course, systematicity alone as a set of observations would not imply that we have to live by that strict code of compositionality. Now, stretching back to the work of Montague, he offered what's called unconstrained compositionality. And I'm just going to quote from an article by Barbara at this point. The central idea is that anything that should count as a grammar should be able to be cast in the following form. The syntax is an algebra, the semantics is an algebra, and there is a homomorphism mapping elements of the syntactic algebra onto elements of the semantic algebra. And then Barbara says it's the homomorphism requirement, which is in effect the compositionality requirement that provides the most important constraint on Eugene Montague's sense. I'm sure that's deep and important. You know, I've been in the business a long time and I still don't quite feel this particular statement in my bones, but this is the kind of core mathematical idea behind compositionality. And following on the heels of this proposal, of course, you had a bunch of results, linguists know about these, that I think were meant to be quite deflationary. So here's one from Zadrozny. Zadrozny just proves in this article, any meaning function that is mapped from forms to meanings can be turned into a compositional one in the sense of the homomorphism requirement. And this is meant to trivialize the compositionality constraint as a constraint on us as linguists, because he's saying that you could live by this code, but it's not actually going to affect any of the analyses you offer. This might be heartbreaking. I love this response from Kazmi and Pelletier. They just respond essentially by saying, wait, what are you talking about? Here is a non-compositional semantics. Just accept right for now that sleep and doze are synonymous. I could grant you that assumption, but deny the assumption that sleep tight has the same meaning as doze tight. I want to do that, and I could just say that that embodies the insight behind the analyses that I want to offer. That is a non-compositional analysis. And their further commentary here is that what the proof actually shows is that you can create a kind of syntactic layer where compositionality holds. And there's similar arguments made throughout the literature. But the point is that just because I could turn this into a different grammar doesn't mean that it's the analysis I want. The correct analysis might be the non-compositional one. Now, there's one more bit of hope here for kind of the formal principle of compositionality that I believed in, at least for a very brief period. And this is offered by David Dowdy under the heading of context-free compositionality. So basically what he's saying is, if I'm giving an analysis of the tree down here and I want to target this meaning gamma prime, then the only information I have access to is the information encapsulated in alpha prime and beta prime. If there has been any information loss in this recursive process going from these daughter nodes down here up to alpha prime, I can't access it when creating the meaning of this entire tree here. And that feels deeply right to me, and it certainly corresponds to how linguists think about compositional interpretation in the modern era. And so that seemed like it was both a formal result and an inspiring insight about how we actually practice semantics. David offered that at a 2003 workshop that Polly put on. And at the very same workshop, in a commentary, Chris Barker just showed in a talk called Compositionality on Demand that this too is not a strict formal constraint on us. And he did a trick very similar to the one from Zadrozny. So, oh well, we don't have our formal principle, but here's the real bottom line for me. We do have this deep and important compositionality heuristic. And so even if we set aside the stream of having a perfect formal reconstruction, there is absolutely no doubt that compositionality has shaped our behavior as semanticists. Let me offer you two examples of this, one positive and one maybe not so positive. So compositionality is a methodology. This is a common theme in the literature. It's not a formal restriction, but a methodology on how to proceed. My example will be subjectless predicational adjuncts. These are things like entering the restaurant, the chef greeted Sandy. And I've offered a very simple meaning analysis here where this is entering the restaurant, this is the subject, the chef, and then the verb phrase greet Sandy. And remember, what Dowdy's principle is saying is that when I derive the meaning up here, I have gamma and I have entering, but I do not have the chef. And for example, I won't be able to detect if the sentence has been passivized or something that would create a synonymous gamma despite syntactic variation. So the idea, the principle, the potential rule that you might offer that you sometimes see in the prescriptive literature is that the implicit argument of a fronted subjectless predicational adjunct must be the subject. So the idea would be that this has to be the implicit argument of this fronted piece up here. Here's the bottom line. Assuming context-free compositionality, the rule cannot be correct as stated. You might be able to come up with a grammar that abides by Dowdy's principle and is in some sense compositional, but it's not going to be the analysis I want to offer. On the analysis that I want to give, this would not be compositional. But here, this is sort of where the pressure is useful on us. So we have this conflict between our theoretical allegiances and our observations. And Arnold Zwicky has the data to show that we should abide by compositionality because he has a rich corpus of examples where the implicit argument to the fronted adjunct is not the subject. Here's the third one is funny when taken out of context. Rich and creamy, your guests will never guess that this pie is light. And if you're unconvinced and feel that that's strange and maybe actually support for the principle, just reflect on whether you noticed that my statement down here would also violate the semantic constraint. So the data plus our theoretical allegiances are pushing us in a very fruitful direction. And that leads us to this pragmatic constraint. The free variable in a subjectless predicational adjunct should refer to a discourse topic, a pragmatic notion. We're essentially going to have a pragmatic free variable up here, and that will be controlled by the discourse. And we happen to have this prescriptive alliance that says, look, in English, subjects are often topics, and that's what led the prescriptivists to propose this as a hard constraint, but it's not, in fact, a grammatical constraint. It's one that's emerging from how language use interacts with these structures. So that's a case where I think compositionality did a really productive thing in pushing us in a good direction empirically. But it has also had some consequences that you might regard as negative. And one of those is the case of noun compounding. So Partee observed, and I think everyone has bought into this, that in compounds, there's no general rule for predicting the interpretation of the combination. They have internal structure, but we can't predict from the parts what the whole will mean. And that is a kind of limit on the compositionality principle. And that might lead us as compositional semanticists to want to exclude compounds entirely from the purview of our study, but that would be a mistake. This lovely article from Beth Levine, Lelia Glass, and Dan Jurafsky shows that there is a lot of systematicity in the interpretation of noun compounds. It's not fully compositional in the sense that we have only partial ability to predict what the meaning of the whole will be from the parts, but it's a lot of predictability. And it would be a shame to say that just because it's not a categorical effect, that means that we can't study it under the rubric of compositional semantics. And that would be a first indication that we might want to move to a more general notion. And just as an aside here, I think actually these points of variation that we witness with compounds are pretty general across modification structures. So even things that Partee has discussed in lots of articles, like the variation that you see with flat tire, flat beer, and flat note, that too is only partially predictable. There's a kind of conceptual core running through the examples, but I think they have some idiomatic aspects to them. And as a result, it's hard to predict for a new modification structure like flat file precisely what the meaning of the whole will be. And so I think that shows that even in regular modification, we might want to back off from the core assumption of compositionality to something more like systematicity and context. Now let me turn to natural language processing, because I think that this is a kind of a field that pushes us to think a little bit more generally about principles like compositionality. I'm going to start with semantic parsing. So here's the semanticist ideal, and please don't worry about all the symbols here. I've put them on the slide just to signal to Barbara that I'm serious, and I did it with type shifters to show Polly that I'm on her team. But the really important thing is just to observe that we as semanticists can derive the fact that every student attended a lecture has a wide scope reading for student where they possibly attended different lectures, and a narrow scope reading for a lecture where they possibly attended different lectures, and a wide scope reading where there's one lecture, say Barbara's, that they all attended. And I think we can perceive both of those readings in that sentence. And we move to a sentence like every child ate a lollipop. Again, we have a narrow scope reading for lollipop where they're all sucking on different lollipops, and a really gross and unrealistic wide scope reading where there's one single lollipop that they all share amongst themselves. And our representational theories just kind of derive all of these meanings and give them equal weight. Is this really so ideal? Would we like to say more about what we observe in data like this? So semantic parsing is one tool where we can start to combine compositional semantics with something like learning and possibly enrich our theories. And the mechanism for doing that is what I've called crude grammars that are refined via learning. So you might remember from the history of natural language processing that in the early 80s, people would construct very large grammars that look a lot like the grammars that are encountered in semantics textbooks. A shining example of that is the Chat-80 system. It can answer incredibly complex questions about Cold War era geography and nothing more. Those systems proved incredibly inflexible. What we have in the modern semantic parsing literature is a really radical departure from that. And so let me just try to get your heads around this idea here. When we write our crude grammar, we're just going to say that the grammar initially consists of rules that have every word assigned to every category, and they have every meaning that they can possibly have. And so this will give very crude grammars that look like this, where I'm making some seemingly good assumptions, like that dog is a noun that means dog, but some very strange assumptions like cat is a noun that means dog. That's a very strange starting point from the point of view of semantics, because we tend not to want rules that are mistaken in our grammars. But here's how we learn from data what the grammar should actually look like. Imagine that some learning instances are coming in. So I get this first example up here, and that gives me 1 point in favor of this rule. And a data-driven process, data is now coming in here, and it's providing evidence for some rules and not others. And as you can imagine, as the data keep pouring in like this, what I begin to piece together is weights on all those rules. And if I want to, in the end, I could extract what looks like an old-fashioned grammar consisting of all the rules that I have any evidence for. But notice that I can also do something more here. So not only can I extract the grammar, but I can also extract usage preferences about which rules tend to be in play in actual data. So again, I can do strictly more than I could in the old mode of regular compositional semantics, but with grammars and tools that look very familiar from that literature. So that's a nice point of contrast there. And just to show you that this is serious, Percy Leong and his groundbreaking thesis did really sophisticated work in this mode involving quantifier scope ambiguities and superlatives and other very complicated things that we as semanticists devote a lot of attention to. Here's the bottom line for this though. I've showed you some feature functions in that previous little example that you might think of as compositional. However, the smart NLPer will also have features that do things like how many distinct lexical items are there in the sentence? Am I in the C command domain of negation? Does the structure contain a specific set of tree fragments? And so forth and so on. What's the average sentiment of words in this sentence? Those will not be things that are strictly compositional. They will involve looking globally at the entire structure. And that might give us pause. We might think, how much of this non-compositional stuff should we as semanticists be bringing into our own theories in the service of being able to explain more? And just to return to that linguist ideal again, by way of wrapping up here. Right, so I wanted to return to the linguist ideal here. Remember, I showed you all these representational theories. Every child ate a lollipop, and we allowed that would have both the wide scope reading of lollipop, where they share a lollipop, and a narrow scope reading. Now in this new mode of semantic parsing, we might be able to not only derive both of those representations, but also say that the narrow scope one has a score of 5, and the wide scope one has a score of -2. And in that way, using the same apparatus that we're familiar with, we may be able to reflect a usage preference or something that might be reflected in human language processing. And that's another sense in which we might be able to do strictly more than we could with purely representational theories. Now, that's the first foray that I want to make from compositional semantics into the world of machine learning and natural language processing. By way of wrapping up, let me do something even more radical, and this would fall under the heading of recursive deep learning models. So we're all familiar as semanticists, take some time, but we get used to the idea that we can interpret compositionally using intentional functions and maybe some core operations like function application. And so we end up with recursive interpretations that look like the structure on the left. But if you think all the way back to Montague's guiding principles, it just said something very general about a homomorphism between a syntax and a semantics. It left completely open in principle what the meanings are like. And in the mode of deep learning, what we do is a radical departure. We're going to deal with all of our meanings as vectors. So here's what a composition function, kind of parallel to function application here, might look like in this new mode. We're going to concatenate 2 child nodes and then feed them through a matrix of learned parameters that we learned from data, and then apply a nonlinear activation function to it, which will give this network a lot of power. And we'll get a new representation out at the top. So here's how that recursive process could go. And instead of bottoming out at the lexicon in the usual sense, it will bottom out in a lexicon that's called an embedding, which would just assign a vector representation to every single one of the words. And you acquire meaning in this context via dimensions along the columns or sets of dimensions or projections into low dimensional spaces. I'm introducing this in a way that I hope feels unfamiliar, and I can just put myself back in the mode of linguists looking at Montague grammar and thinking that it was strange and odd and maybe unproductive. If you're having some of that feeling about these vectors, I would encourage you to just think in a forward-looking way about whether this might be able to capture meaning in the sense that you want to capture it. Here's a little bit of a sense for how this actually works. So just to shrink it down to a very interpretable example, keeping in mind that models trained in this way often have hundreds of millions of parameters. So this will be a very small view. But I've got this simple phrase like not terrible here. And the pretense is that terrible has this dimension representing its negativity, and this dimension here representing its kind of overall emphaticness. And when I combine that with negation, I apply that composition function there, including these learned weights. And what I get out is a representation that's a little bit less on the negative side and a little bit attenuated on that second dimension. And in that way, you're starting to see how compositional analysis might work in this mode. Now, NLPers have been very ambitious about applying these models, and they've actually followed in many ways the template that we get from compositional semantics. So we have in the literature a lot of models that interpret full tree structures like this. And just keep in mind that instead of function application, I've got that new function f, the complicated vector one, applied at each node. And each one of those nodes denotes a vector. And then you get a vector meaning for the entire sentence. Now, like linguists, NLPers often want to deal with simplified structures. So many of them look strictly right branching like this. And in NLP, they tend to write them as simple sequence models like this, which is a very different perspective on which pieces are related to which other pieces. But nonetheless shows you that there is a kind of recursive interpretation process happening behind the scenes for these models. And that a really interesting departure in this literature is, of course, they don't feel so much allegiance to having particular tree structures. So it's very common for them to add a lot of supplementary connections that essentially associate every node in one of these structures with every other node. And then the idea is that via a data-driven learning process, we would learn to figure out which of those connections are important. So it's a very different perspective on what structure is like, and a very different perspective on how a data-driven learning process might affect the structures that we ultimately think we've observed. And I think this is really providing a new perspective on compositionality. And one way to start thinking about that is actually foreshadowed in Barbara's classic 1984 paper called Compositionality, which is actually, like this talk, a kind of meditation on the potential limits of that principle. And in that context, she discussed what looked like global influences for local computations in the compositional process. And I think we see that everywhere in these deep learning models. So we have a tree structure as before, and that looks reassuringly familiar. However, a crucial component in that model is this matrix of learned parameters W here, and that will be exerting global influences. It is used at every single one of the nodes potentially, and it was learned from all the available data. And so in that way, inevitably, we're getting a kind of distribution of effects of local computations throughout these structures. And if you stare closely at my little example from before, you might start to get a feel for that, because although the computation works out in the end, the effect of negation is kind of interestingly distributed not only across this morpheme with this vector meaning, but also through these learned parameters W here, which are going to be used globally in the grammar. And so it's kind of like we have a diffusion of these local computations throughout the structure, even as we're doing something that looks like a compositional operation. And we could return to that linguist ideal again, right? So I showed you before in the context of semantic parsing that we have a strictly additive effect on traditional semantic theories because we can do everything they do plus user preference, like speaker preferences and things like that. Things look very different in the context of deep learning just because in the end, what you get is not a structured symbolic representation that's easy to interpret, but rather a vector. And it's very hard to think about how you might use that vector to reason about whether the subject was wide or narrow scope, or how this sentence relates to certain other sentences in a model theoretic sense. So we're giving something up a little bit in exchange for some new things. And here's actually kind of personal example of that. So this is work that I was involved with. Again, a recursive model that has vectors as all of its meanings. And this model could make predictions about the sentiment score for every single one of the nodes in these tree structures. And one thing we were able to do in that work is build a convincing case that the data were telling us together with the model that sentences like X but Y are in a way conceding X and an argument for Y. And you can see that in the structure here because the sentiment of the second part, the second conjunct to but, is what becomes the dominant sentiment for the whole. And that happens very systematically and shows that kind of argumentative aspect of the connective but. So that felt like a real victory in terms of pragmatics. However, in the context of these models, it felt like we were unable to comment in any meaningful way on the sense in which but is a coordinating expression with a conventional implicature, which is a problem I care deeply about. The theory is just not giving you the tools and language to think in those traditional model theoretic terms. And so I think that shows two things, that this theory is pushing us to think of data and problems of one kind, whereas compositional semantics traditionally pushes us to think about a different set of problems. And that's just generally showing that the tools we choose are shaping the questions we decide to take on. And this is a good place to conclude here. So what I hope I've done in part is just complicate your view of compositionality and how it might relate to broader notions of systematicity, and also get you thinking about the relationship between linguistic semantics and what's happening in natural language processing. And here's a kind of scorecard. So if the recursive property of compositionality was the thing that you really cared about, notice that all three of these theories, from semantics to deep learning, can have a recursive aspect. If the symbolic aspect of this was your focus, now we have some distinctions. Semantic parsing and semantics are both symbolic, whereas deep learning is based entirely in those very abstract vector representations. Compositional, I think it's a real question. Of course, the semantic theories are compositional, or at least strive to be. Semantic parsing has some compromises on that point by introducing some feature functions that would attend to global properties of all the examples. And of course, for deep learning, I just don't know how to answer the question of whether it's compositional or not. Precise, in semantics, we can give precise accounts of specific inference patterns. I think the first two theories can do that, but in deep learning, it's still an open question about whether we'll be able to tackle those kind of problems. I noted that semantic theories tend to be purely representational. If there's a multitude of different representations, there are many meanings, and we don't comment on which of those is preferred in context. The other two theories from NLP certainly do comment on that as a byproduct of their data-driven learning processes. You have an interesting distinction at the level of the lexicon. In semantics, we tend to distinguish open class lexical items as separate from functional ones. These other two theories might or might not make those distinctions, but you certainly get a blurring of those traditional boundaries within semantics. Is there a sharp semantics pragmatics distinction? For semantics, we traditionally give an answer of yes, and we have just a few hooks into the broader world of language use. For semantic parsing and deep learning, we're always learning these theories from usage data, and as a result, they blur the boundary between semantics and pragmatics almost from their very foundations. And in terms of scalability, if you wanted to tackle really big problems, I think we've seen that our theories are not scalable in that sense. They require too much hand-built attention. But as we move to semantic parsing and up into deep learning, we can tackle ever larger and more ambitious problems. And finally, we might have the dual of that, which is that in semantics, we're accustomed to having kind of deep analytic insights about individual examples. But again, as we move from semantic parsing and through to deep learning, we're going to give up on some of that analytic control in service of achieving other goals. Let me wrap up here, though, and just remind you. So I started with the Partee genealogy, and I showed you that this is a kind of picture of the far-reaching influence that Barbara's ideas have had on the entire field of semantics. And what I'm trying to convey to you with these new developments in NLP is that that influence extends well beyond semantics. And increasingly over the last 5 years, you have seen an explosion of work that is using the idea of compositionality in the context of these large-scale problems. And there's just an outpouring of these papers, and you can see that in some ways, they're going to come at these problems with a more critical perspective because they haven't adopted as a foundational principle that compositionality is true, but rather they're exploring it as a potentially useful technique. But there's no doubt that this is going to play an increasingly prominent role. It might do that under the rubric of this more general notion of systematicity. It's hard to predict at this point, but one thing is absolutely clear. At root of all of this exciting new work is those ideas that Barbara discovered and was such a good ambassador with to the rest of us in the early 70s that we've been trying to work out and find the consequences of ever since. And I think all of us, not only in this field, but in many fields throughout computation and the cognitive sciences, owe Barbara a huge thanks for introducing all these fertile ideas into the landscape. So thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Chris, for a great talk. To conclude our day of exciting talks, we have a few minutes left for questions. We're running behind a little bit, but we're not going to steal that Q&A from you. So as a reminder to the audience, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature. Panelists, obviously you can just send me a chat or wave at me, I see you. I have a question from, I'm afraid I will not pronounce, the name right, Adria Urrutia, and I'm going to give you permission to talk, if you can unmute yourself.
Hi, hello, thank you.
Hello.
Excuse me, because, well, thank you, great talk. I really appreciate it. Maybe this is a silly question, but I was just wondering about it. What happens with languages that there is almost no data about? How much data do you need to build a matrix vectors? Maybe semantics and semantic parsing have an advantage in these cases. Just want your opinion. What do you think about this? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question and very insightful. Here's what I'd say the dynamic is. So where you have essentially infinite data for a language like English, you can afford to adopt a model like I showed you before, where you make almost no assumptions about what linguistic data will look like, because your data-driven process might ultimately tell you what the model should actually think of as important and what's connected to what. When you move into areas where you don't have essentially infinite data, it becomes much more important that you have made correct linguistic assumptions. And again, I think this is just a huge opportunity for linguists to get involved. You know, if we did want to do something that was richly typological, we would do well as natural language processors to pay attention to the points of variation that Seth was highlighting, for example, because that might be our only hope of doing well in that low data regime.
Thank you very much. And I love the comparison of the three models. Really, really good talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a few questions from panelists, but since we have the panel discussion, I'll save those maybe for later. Eric Acton has a question. Let me unmute you, Eric. Okay, you're allowed to talk.
Hi, Chris. I loved the talk.
Thank you, Eric.
Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay, great. I just had a question that, you know, since the traditional compositionality approach kind of binds syntax and semantics so closely together, because you're reading these meanings off the structures. How, if at all, has the machine learning approach sort of thrown some of our assumptions about structure or the way that we approach structure into question? Because we're not trying to, you know, sort of read it off in this sort of perfectly binary recursive way. I was just curious if you can say anything about that.
Oh, it's a wonderful question. Yeah, there's a lot I could say. I mean, one thing I'd say is, like, going back all the way to, you know, Partee as an ambassador for this idea. She's always described this as a collaboration, essentially, between syntax and semantics, where both sides are adjusting assumptions to give a satisfying account. And I think we're seeing some of that in NLP as well, as people try to jointly learn how to do the parsing and the semantics. And I think that's like a kind of data-driven perspective on this core insight. And I think it could be really exciting to think about that. The other thing I would say about representation is that it's very common in this literature, and maybe this resonates with the psycholinguists, to essentially have theories that represent a lot of different potential structures simultaneously, possibly with different weights. So instead of having to fix a single structure for an utterance, you might be entertaining multiple of them at once. And that could serve your goal, your predictive goal, and maybe it also has a cognitive insight behind it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, great. I have a couple more questions for panelists. Mitch, you want to go ahead and ask yours?
Sure. I have actually two questions. I'll give you both, pick one. First, not as a technology, but as a story about how kids learn language. You know, neural nets work great if you've got 1 billion words or so, but kids, you know, have got a few million, right? So, you know, might this be a different kind of system? And the other question is a little technical, and that is, as we saw from Stan Peters' work way back when, extended by Aravind Joshi, if you allow context-free filters of tremendous richness, including Booleans, right, on context-free structures, those things remain context-free. So might not it be possible to actually fold these kinds of ad hoc features into compositional structures and still have them remain compositional?
Oh. This is great. So for the first thing, the first comment, I'm not decided on this view, and I would just want to offer a complementary perspective, which is The only reason these models need billions of words is because words are all they get. They don't get anything like embodiment or other kinds of sensory input. There's no social aspect to their language learning. And as a result, they have to rely entirely on this very thin stream of information. If these learners were more multimodal, then perhaps they would get by with less text. And I think that's a vision that we could present as linguists and cognitive scientists. And I think it's really productive in the era of deep learning where you have models that can represent lots of different modalities flexibly and synthesize them. Because ultimately, a baby is a big data machine. They get a tremendous amount of input. And it's just a matter of harnessing that and channeling it toward language learning. For the second point, I'm not sure what to make of that, because that might be an instance of that dynamic between Zadrodny and Kazmi and Pelletier, where you say, you offered something non-compositional and maybe you intended it to be such, and the fact that you can turn it into something that's actually abiding by the compositional principle might actually do some violence to my insight. And we can decide for ourselves what that means.
All right, I think we have time for one last final question from Partee here on the panel.
Thanks. So actually, I think your last thing you said partially answers the question I was going to ask, which is, I don't know exactly how to phrase this well, but you talked about with these things, you not only learn sort of the meaning, but these sort of usage preferences and so forth. But my reaction to that is, well, these dumb machines don't know anything except the language they're being fed. We smart people have this whole ton of additional knowledge that we're bringing in, which is what gives us the usage preferences. I don't need to learn the usage preferences. They ought to be a consequence of the fact that I'm human and know lots and lots and lots of stuff. So I guess my question, now you sort of answered it by saying ultimately you want to actually put all that human stuff into these machines. But for now, until that's done, my question is some of the goals that you're getting from looking at this learning, where you're feeding it only language and not all the stuff that we smart people, even as babies, already have, is that something that we as linguists should actually get excited about? Or should we only get excited about it when you're modeling the full everything that humans have at their disposal, which is a big project?
Yeah, these are great points to think about. So like concretely for my example of the kids with the lollipop,
right,
where we have a clear bias for one interpretation because of world knowledge.
Right.
My theory would capture that just as an indirect fact that in the data, maybe only one reading is really represented. And you might say that that is not a deep explanation for that. This is just a kind of, it's just learning a kind of reflection of something about the world. Exactly. And what we really want is models that could directly incorporate that world knowledge. I think that's a wonderful perspective. The only thing I could say in defense of what I proposed is, at least in the near term, I would have a theory that could make a lot of relevant predictions for people doing sentence processing or just trying to understand usage data for practical NLP. And so I might be okay with that, even while I grant you that a deeper explanation would, of course, be more satisfying.
Great, thank you. I think it's time to wrap up this discussion. Thank you again, Chris, for a wonderful talk. And I understand we now will switch to the panel discussion. So the panelists are invited to turn their videos back on, and I will switch to gallery view so people can see everyone, I hope. And Mitch, Charles, you guys tell me how to proceed with the panel organization.
Let's proceed. Right.
Could I ask a question of Florian?
Sure.
So Florian, I loved your talk, and I loved especially the kind of overall vision that you presented. One thing that was on my mind is that the paper by Barbara that you started with, one of its central themes is this kind of perceived tension between model theory, possible worlds models, and cognitive science. And there's a kind of another aspect to that, which is that we as linguists tend to be kind of suspicious of representations. We tend to think that the model theory is the thing that really matters for studies of meaning. And I'm wondering about your perspective on all of that. You did offer some representations, and I was wondering whether you think of that as the primary vehicle for the explanations that you're offering, as a departure from the way semanticists usually think.
I think that's at least a possibility we have to take seriously. I'm not sure I'm ready to commit in any given particular case to really know which way we should go in that regard. But certainly my current take, looking back on that first study that I presented on, I meant that caveat sort of seriously, that I don't know yet, and I don't know that we have any good evidence to think whether these DRT style representations are something that really is directly reflective of our linguistic knowledge and the processes of using that linguistic knowledge, or whether this is just, surely we have rich representations of context and our surroundings that somehow must interface with these sort of linguistic sort of updates. And I think it's a really hard question to know at what level these things come in. So I think, yes, the tension that is in Barbara's paper, I think we still live with, and I'm not sure we're that much further in terms of how to resolve it, other than I certainly adhering to Barbara's closing words there of saying, let's try to do both, but linking those up and then understanding what's really in the semantics and the grammar and the linguistic knowledge and how to capture that is hard. I think, kind of various people alluded to also the dimension of the possible worlds and the size of those sets and so on, that those are just hard to fit into our heads. And that's, I think everybody can agree to that. And yet, right, we capture a lot by modeling things in those ways. So the link between the formal models and what's actually in our heads, very much to me, I think is still what we need to bridge. And sort of your talk offers interesting other dimensions for approaching that. But beyond that, I'll cop out on answering. I don't know if I'll let others chime in. Barbara, do you want to?
I would love to hear what Barbara
I'm pointing at Seth.
Exactly.
Seth has a question. I want him to ask it.
I have a question on a different topic. So let me pause. Let's pause to see if anybody wanted to follow up.
Barbara, did you want to share your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I wanted to have a moment to say thank you to all of you who were on the panel, because this was just, this was just beyond my wildest dreams. There were such wonderful talks, everybody's distinctive content. Everybody was so nice to me. and it was, I thought it was a beautiful picture of all the different facets of what's going on and what's going to be going on. And I just, thank you.
You are not that hard to be nice to, Barbara.
Thank you.
Can we thank you for inviting us too? It's such an honor to be invited.
My pleasure.
So I had a question for Chris. So there was Chris, in your answer to one of your questions, you were mentioning about how some of the computational work would want to be informed by principles we might understand from looking at languages cross-linguistically. One thing that occurred to me, though, in also upon hearing the ending of your discussion, where you're kind of comparing and contrasting sort of traditional formal semantic approaches to these kinds of computational approaches you're discussing, was that the latter don't offer, or it seemed like you were saying something along the lines of, the latter don't offer necessarily as rich a treatment of the semantics of functional items as we get in sort of more traditional model theoretic semantics. And I just wanted to put out there that that's kind of been a lot of the bread and butter of work that's been done in cross-linguistic semantics. There's been a lot of attention principally on functional items and how they can differ, what exactly they're contributing to the meaning of sentences broadly, and how they vary across languages. So if you look at kind of the list of the topics that I had, they all really center around the functional vocabulary. And there's not that much attention paid to say matters of lexical semantics or the kinds of just straightforward principles of compositionality. A lot of it is kind of you know, even to the extent that there may seem to be differences in how phrases are compositionally put together, those are sometimes, you know, perhaps just chalked up to functional items, either at a more observable or more abstract level. So I guess the question I have for you is, to what extent do you see these approaches being extensible, I guess, in better ways than they currently are to functional vocabulary, things like, you know, modals, comparative operators, those sorts of things that have been a lot of the bread and butter for formal semanticists.
Those are wonderful observations. I could just comment a little bit. So yes, that is true about the current state of deep learning. So for semantic parsing, in principle, you could try to learn what the function words mean. In practice, people just write those down and learn the rest of the grammar, which could be taken as a provocative claim about what's learnable. I'll set that aside. In the deep learning space, yes, it's true. There's almost no special attention to the functional lexicon. I would just step back and say, one argument, like we're focused on the functional lexicon because we have a toolkit that's really good at that part of language. And in turn, we neglect a lot of the open domain lexicon because our toolkit is not so useful for it. Exactly the converse is true of deep learning. You get really rich pictures of nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs, and you don't do so well with the function words. The other thing I'd want to say here is that a problem that everyone recognizes is that these models, these deep learning models, are not systematic. You know, set aside the compositionality thing, and you can just observe behaviorally that their predictions do not align with human intuitions, and that's what makes them so surprising. I believe that a big problem there is that they're not getting good representations for the nuts and bolts of the language. And when they overcome that problem, we're going to see much more systematicity, and that's going to imply, I don't know what you want to call it, modularity, or maybe compositionality for the internal representations of these systems.
Can I follow up on this discussion a little bit? Having just finished a semester of lexical semantics teaching. So first, I've never been really clear that there's a sharp distinction between the functional vocabulary and lexical vocabulary. I think that's not really a sharp distinction. And I think that and so you said something also about formal semantics has neglected the kind of lexical semantics outside of the functional vocabulary. But I don't really think that's true. I mean, I'm thinking of all the work on verbal semantics, for example, you know, the Bendler, Dowdy, and so forth. That's really fine-grained. Okay, it's true, there's a certain component we're not looking at, you know, exactly what every component about run is versus die versus kill or whatever. But, you know, we're looking at a lot of fine-grained detail when we look at verbal semantics, and that's part of the bread and butter of formal semantics. So, I mean, I remember having a little argument with Angelica about this on Facebook or something. It's not really an argument, it was just a comment I made to something she gave in a talk that was posted where she said, you know, that compositional semantics, if I'm misquoting Angelica, I really apologize, but I think it was something like, you know, people don't worry so much about the lexical semantics. And I just don't think there is that fine distinction. And I think tons of stuff on lexical semantics has been a mainstream part of compositional semantics. You know, what does seek mean, for example? To go back to very early things. So I just wanted to make that comment.
I guess I was sort of channeling, I remember Greg Carlson at the start of his thesis says, I wanted to learn what the meaning of the word life was or the associated concept. And I learned by the end of the quarter that we should be concentrating on the much juicier problem of pronouns. That is an aspect of our field, but I love your perspective, Polly, that yeah, we have concentrated in the deep learning perspective. What you would say is that lexical items are very high dimensional objects with lots of meaning dimensions. We have concentrated on a few of them, you know, aspect and things like that. And there are many more dimensions, so many, in fact, that we might never have analytic control over all of them. And we might prefer a deep learning model as a mechanism for understanding the true extent of these semantic connections.
Gennaro, you should go.
Yes, I'd like to chime in on this discussion. The fact that, you know, there are boundary issues between the functional lexicon and the content lexicon doesn't mean that the distinction isn't ultra robust and, in fact, foundational for our job. The criteria for deciding whether something belongs to the functional component or the content component of the lexicon are multiple and very, very strong. And they range from their syntactic positioning. So with respect to, say, the basic word order of a language, the functional lexicon will tend to be to the periphery of the content categories, to semantic criteria like having higher types and being domain invariant, being a sort of permutation invariant, to even neurolinguistics evidence that shows that the functional lexicon is systematically affected differently by language pathologies than the content lexicon. So, yes, absolutely. There is an issue of boundary, but at the same time, the criteria pile up so much across a different, spectrum that I don't see how it can be questioned, really.
So I actually had a related question, or rather invitation to have Gennaro say more, but in relation to things that both Partee said and with respect to Chris's talk, concerning the sort of function and content distinction. Is kind of two parts to it. One was fairly specific and more related to my own interest, namely that you briefly alluded to, Gennaro, the way in which we see these sort of, L analyticity effects for presuppositions as well. But on that side, I'm actually now, very curious for where the function content distinction for the relevant presuppositional items there falls, because it seems less obvious to me. I guess on the bigger picture, I was just also curious along the lines of where the discussion already was. What's something, if we accept the notion that what you talked about, that there are semantic reasons to rule things out in the grammar, how that might relate to sort of the perspective that Chris has put forward. And it's a very open-ended question. I haven't thought it through, but I would love to hear others take. And since it relates to your talk, so I was going to ask you first.
So that's, when you say you mean me?
Oh, yes, sorry,
Okay.
Yes, Gennaro, you, Gennaro.
Because the ixis is very ambiguous in this setup. So, well, what you say about presupposition is extremely right and interesting, right? There have been some serious recent attempts at developing theories of triggerings, which is what you're talking about in a way. And, Philippe has tried, Clemens Meyer has tried, and they are possibly barking up the right trees in different ways. Some of it might be less complicated. For instance, take factivity, right? So factivity might be something comp-related. So it may be that some version of the old Kiparsky ideas that factivity comes from the comp turns out to be right. So, I would look at a mix of these things for the answer. Yeah, that was, I think, the main point, no? The extension to presupposition of this question. And also in general, right? This holds across the board. Some things are very unlikely to be located in functional elements, right? For instance, the mass count distinction, insofar as I know, is very rarely encoded, if ever, in an overt morpheme. Sometimes, there is some parasitic stuff, so all residues of, say, the neuter would be interpreted in a mass count way, but normally you don't have, productive mass count morphology the way in which you have number morphology. And yet it's one of the most robust cross-linguistic differences that there is, right? And so meaning postulates, by all means, right? If they are general. If they are general enough, no qualms with those. So structural constraint of the seek type, fine. The thing is how general it is and how well they account for cross-linguistic variation. That's the ultimate judge of any proposal.
Let me mention that the audience is welcome to send in questions to the panelists also.
So we have
a
one
really
from-
cool question here, yeah.
We have one from Daniel Lassiter. Shall
Okay, hi. I guess
yes.
I'm allowed to say it. I'll just read what I
Yes.
wrote, okay? So you guys don't need to read it. So what I wrote was, one lesson that emerges from the discussion today is that historically formal semantics has owed an enormous amount to deep theoretical engagement with other fields. And so I'm thinking about the future of the field. You know, we had some examples already of people talking about really productive areas for future development. We saw, you know, experimental psycholinguistics and that connection in Florian's talk. You know, Seth pointed to cross-linguistic semantics. Chris pointed to natural language processing and deep learning. And I was just thinking, you know, there's a lot more out there. So just, I was wondering if you know, if you guys have ideas about, you know, where are the exciting new ideas that we have yet to incorporate into our thinking? Where should we be looking for the kind of next generation of exciting developments that are going to revolutionize formal semantics yet again?
It's a wonderful question, Dan. Could I give an opinionated partial answer?
Please.
I would exhort people to look beyond mere representation and start thinking about developing theories that can capture usage preferences and things like that directly as first-class theoretical constructs. Our literature in semantics is overflowing with insights about where a modal is likely to be interpreted in one way or another, or where quantifier scopes are likely to have one form or another. We build only a tiny fraction of that into our theories, just the parts that seem convenient and easy to kind of reflect in syntactic representation or something similar. We should be thinking about theories that could be much more all-encompassing to kind of capture those ideas as first-class theoretical constructs and use them to make predictions and experiments.
Gennaro.
Well, I'll give a partial and opinionated answer as well. I think that what's emerging from current research is a beautifully rich and complex inventory of logically based functors. So, you know, there is a structure of models, a structure of polarity sensitive quantifiers, and a structure of alternative sensitive quantifiers with very robust common traits. And I want to know where they come from. So we are kind of getting much better at dealing with this. So we know, for example, that, I don't know, say alternative sensitive quantifiers are the only, even, and also type are super pervasive cross-linguistically. And, you know, so you get exclusive, miratives, and additives throughout the languages of the world. There is tremendous microvariation, so that if you go on to the next language, you will get very confused as to trying to pinning down which one is only, which one is even, and which one is also. But at the same time, there is, you know, there is recurrence. There are some common traits to these elements, and we've gotten just a lot better in identifying these logically grounded, because they are all logically grounded functions. Frankly, if I were to start today, that's the question that I would ask. Where are they coming from? Why those? I have no doubts that a deep learning machine could learn them, but I want to know why those classes.
Let me offer an answer to Dan on a different level. When I think back, I had no idea where I was going in my studies, and there were these things I loved, and I found a way to put them together. And I sometimes feel like a lot of students think they have to have a 10-year plan for how they're going to, they have to know what they're going to do by the time they end of high school or something. So when we teach, whatever we're teaching, if we can teach in a way to let our students know that whatever they're interested in might be part of the future, that we don't like, I don't know what are going to be the great future interests, but I want our students to feel free and to know that the open questions are going to be theirs, and that whatever they're interested in, there might be a way to combine it with the things that we know about now, and let them explore.
I would just kind of, following up from everything everyone has said, just put in a very simple plug that a constant source of inspiration and exciting new ideas and puzzles is always to be drawn from some new and relatively understudied language. So we've only begun, as sure everybody knows, we've only begun to just start to skim the surface of the really fascinating varieties of interpretations that different items in different languages can get, and how they vary, and as Chinara was mentioning, so often one sees things that look almost like things you're familiar with, but then there's something critically different about them. And that is just, I think that has just turned out to be such a rich ground for study by semanticists. And again, it's because we have, as Chinara mentioned and Chris mentioned, we have these tools. This part of being trained to be a semanticist was also thinking formally and precisely about meaning, and being able to frame in more precise mathematical ways hypotheses about the contributions that expressions could be making to the meanings of a sentence, presuppositions or asserted content or what have you. And so, learning about this toolkit and then going out to apply it to cases from some language you've just started studying it's frustrating you is always has, is always just a rich place to look for uncovering something new and exciting. Yeah, that's a lot.
Oh, I wanted to add one other thing. Going back to, it was Lila who got to introduce me today as a wonderful surprise. And her area is language acquisition. And that's one area we didn't have today. We had Florian's experimental work, but we didn't have any language acquisition work. And looking at language acquisition cross-linguistically and cross-modally and all those things, to try to, that's gotta be a tremendously important source of insights into what's part of our innate capacity and how things can vary and all those things. So that's that area's got to be increasingly rich.
Along very similar lines, I think I would argue that, what I tried to sort of close on very briefly, but in line with what Seth just said and parallel to what Barbara said about acquisition, just bringing together the cross-linguistic angle and ideally the understudied language angle, and use what we can nowadays quite easily in terms of experimental investigations is going, it's more than just two already existing streams of work. It's really building a whole new stream of work with tremendous potential for insights, precisely, or among other things, for those sorts of questions where we ask, is this, language specific or domain general? Because, well, if you can find, right, parallel constructions, context, etc., in different languages, kind of like what Seth was doing with the tense examples with different, by extension, sort of if we can find things and languages vary, well, then there seems to be some language specific encoding. And if not, that may be arguments for more domain general things. So I think that's still something where actually a lot of new ground can be broken by bringing together these different avenues.
On that note, one of the things that came very strongly when we were building the case for Barbara was the supportive and nurturing role she played in fostering the cognitive science community, where linguistics is being a very big part of it. And so I hope this tradition will certainly continue. So maybe we can wrap things up as we have, now it's about 3:30. So we thank you for participating. We thank the audience for joining from all over the world. And we offer our congratulations again to Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Great.
Bye-bye. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.